I've never really told anyone about what happened to me when I was 9 years old. Mostly because my family moved out of Ohio a few months later, and my brain spent years trying to convince me that I had just misunderstood a completely innocent interaction. But I'm 21 now, and looking back at the mechanics of that night, I still feel a cold and hollow weight sink into my center whenever I think about just how close I came to stepping off the map. It was late August of 2014. My hometown was hosting its annual county fair, a massive muddy spectacle of neon carnival rides, diesel tractor pulls, and grease-soaked food stands. In our community, the fair was treated like a giant communal backyard event. Parents would buy their kids a wristband for the rides, hand them a $20 bill for some cakes, and basically just let them run wild in packs without a single shred of adult supervision until the gates closed at midnight. My dad was volunteering at the local high school's Busta club tent that evening, flipping burgers over a massive iron grill, which meant that I had several hours of unmonitored freedom. By 9:30, a heavy summer thunderstorm had rolled through, turning the dirt midways into thick, sucking sludge. The crowds, they started thinning out, and the air smelled heavy of wet livestock and fried dough. I had wandered away from the bright, noisy center of the Ferris wheel and ended up behind the animal exhibition barns near the edge of the fairgrounds property. This area was dead quiet. On one side was the windowless corrugated metal wall of the swine barn, and on the other was a dense unlit tree line separated from the fair by a rusted chain-link fence. Running parallel to the fence was a deep concrete drainage ditch completely filled with pitch-black rushing rainwater from the storm. The only light came from a single flickering bulb mounted high up in the barn's eave, casting long jittery shadows across the mud. I was standing near a stack of wooden livestock pellets, trying to scrape clay off the heels of my sneakers, when a woman stepped out from the dark space between the two trailer beds. She didn't look like any of the local farm mums, too. She was wearing an incredibly oversized, grease-stained yellow raincoat that swallowed her frame down to her shins, and her dark hair was absolutely soaked, clinging to her skull in thin, stringy patches. But it was her face that really made me catch my breath. She had this tight, unblinking glare, her eyes darting frantically from my face to the dark tree line behind the fence, her jaw twitching a bit. The second that she saw me look up, her expression snapped into a massive, jagged grin that looked completely unnatural, like someone forcing their face to mimic happiness. "Oh, thank goodness," she gasped, her voice high, thin, and breathless. "Hey there, sweetie. Can you do me a really quick favor? I desperately need a little helper." I was a very quiet and compliant kid growing up, conditioned to always respect adults. So I took a step forward and nodded. "What's wrong, ma'am?" She pointed a hand down into the deep, shadowy concrete drainage ditch, right where it disappeared into a heavy corrugated iron culvert pipe beneath the fence line. It was totally dark inside of that pipe, and the sound of the water rushing through it was a low and hollow gurgle. My little girl was playing with her favorite silver bracelet, and it slipped right down into the mouth of that pipe, the woman said, leaning over so close that I could now smell the sharp chemical reek of cheap lighter fluid and damp wool on her clothes. "The opening is way too narrow for my shoulders, but you're nice and skinny. If you just slid down into the ditch and crawl a few feet into the pipe, you can grab it right up for her." A sudden powerful wave of revulsion hit me so hard that my mouth went completely dry. My body was giving me a massive primitive warning signal before my brain could even rationalize why. I took 2 deliberate steps backward into the light of the bulb, squinting toward the black mouth of the culvert pipe. As I stared, I distinctly heard a wet, heavy boot slide against the gravel inside of the metal pipe, a sharp, distinct scraping sound that definitely did not come from running water. The woman noticed me backing away, and her frantic energy spiked. She reached out, her wet, cold plastic sleeve brushing against my forearm, and her grin stretched even wider. "Don't be scared, sweetie. Your mum is Sarah, right? The one working over at the school Busta tent?" she asked, her voice turning incredibly fast, almost aggressive. My mother's name wasn't Sarah, mind you. She wasn't even at the fairgrounds that night, in fact. She was back at home with my baby brother. The woman had just glanced at the high school logo printed on my t-shirt and guessed a common local name to try and trick me. Yes," I lied, my voice shaking so hard that I could barely form the word. "See? Sarah and I are old friends from church." She lied right back, clapping her hands together in a theatrical hollow gesture. "She told me that I could use you to help find it. Tell you what, if you just hop down into that ditch and get that bracelet, I'll take you right over to one of those game trailers and buy you one of those massive stuffed prizes. It'll only take a second, sweetie. Just jump down there." The desperation radiating off of her was terrifying now. She was practically hovering over me, blocking my path back to the main midway. I can't," I blurted out, my chest tightening until it hurt to inhale. "My dad told me that I have to come back to the grill right now. He's counting the cash box and needs me to hold the bank bag." The woman's manic, friendly facade instantly collapsed. Her jaw dropped into a flat, dead sneer, and the frantic twitch in her cheek flared up. Her eyes went completely cold with an unhinged, ugly rage. But before she could reach me, a loud burst of laughter echoed from the other side of the barn as two teenagers in muddy boots turned the corner, sharing a box of fries. The second that she saw them, her fake smile slammed back into her face like a mask. "You're such a good little helper," she said, her voice dripping with an artificial venomous sweetness meant entirely for the benefit of the teenagers walking past. "I'll be sure to tell your father exactly how responsible you're being tonight." I didn't reply. I turned around and sprinted through the mud as fast as my legs would carry me, not stopping until I slammed into the wooden counter of the booster tent, catching my breath in the bright, smoky air next to my dad's grill. I stayed right by his side too, under that fluorescent light bulb until the fair completely shut down. When we were driving home later in his truck that night, the headlights cutting through the dark country roads, I finally looked over at him. "Dad, does a woman in a big yellow raincoat go to our church? The one who said that she knows Sarah?" My dad glanced at me, confused. "No, Bug, I don't think so. Why do you ask?" When I laid out the entire sequence of events, the drainage pipe, the silver bracelet story, and that heavy, wet scraping sound from inside of the dark iron tube, my dad's face went completely rigid. He pulled over right there on the gravel shoulder, grabbed his phone, and called the county sheriff's department from the cab of his truck. 2 cruisers went down to the fairgrounds that night, but since the event was wrapping up and hundreds of out-of-town carnies were packing up their rigs, they obviously never found her. I still get a sick feeling in my throat whenever it rains heavily in the summer now. I try to tell myself that maybe she was just a frantic, eccentric mother who genuinely lost a piece of jewelry, and maybe there was somebody down there trying to help her already or something like that. But then I remember the fake church friend, the intense rage in her eyes when I refused, and that unmistakable wet slide of a boot shifting weight inside of the dark mouth of that pipe. I am pretty confident that there wasn't a bracelet in that tunnel at all. There was a second person waiting there in the dark for me, and if I had climbed down into that concrete ditch, I really don't think that I ever would have been seen again. In the winter of 2024, my fiancé and I booked a cheap weekend trip to an old town in upstate New York. We wanted a quick getaway from the city, and the place had this heavy, historic feel to it with lots of old brick buildings and colonial houses. We rented a bedroom through a home share site for the last night of the trip. The house was a massive 3-story Victorian place that had been split into separate apartments. Our rental was all the way on the top floor. The owner wasn't home, but they had left the key in the lockbox by the front porch. I walked up the creaky wooden steps ahead of my fiancée to carry our bags up. The apartment door was painted a dark flat grey with a brass number 3 screwed onto the center. And the second that I unlocked it and stepped into the hallway, just a heavy sort of weird feeling hit me. It wasn't like a supernatural vibe or anything, it was more just this immediate sharp instinct that somebody else was already inside, standing just out of sight. I sat the bags down and walked through the rooms, checking the window latches and the back fire escape door just to shake the feeling. The place was spotless. The kitchen counters were wiped down and the dining table was neatly set for 2 people, with the forks and the knives perfectly lined up next to the plates. The cleaner had clearly spent a lot of time making everything look pristine. Well, everything except for one thing in our bedroom. You see, against the far wall sat a heavy old-fashioned wooden wardrobe. It was a massive piece of furniture too, easily 7 feet tall, and one of its thick wooden doors was hanging wide open, exposing the dark, empty inside. It felt totally out of place. I mean, why would the cleaner take the time to perfectly align the silverware on the table but leave a giant wardrobe door hanging open like that? I stared at it for a second, feeling a tingle of sweat on the back of my neck, before snapping the door shut, right as my fiancée walked into the room with her coat. She loved the apartment immediately, and didn't notice anything weird. But as I brought our bags inside, I noticed a strange sort of architectural detail about the layout. Our bedroom and the living room shared a wall, but when you looked at the apartment from the main hallway, there was a massive dead space between the 2 rooms. There was a gap about 4 feet wide, I would say, plenty of space for a small closet or a utility room. And when I looked closely at the wallpaper in our bedroom, I could see the faint rectangular outline of an old door frame that had been completely papered over. The wallpaper was slightly sunken through the edges, stretching a little bit over it. I'm 30 years old, and I've only had a severe gut warning about a physical place a couple of times in my life, and this was one of them. My arms were completely covered in goosebumps, but we ordered pizza anyway, ate dinner using the fancy silverware, and tried to relax a little bit, but I just couldn't stop looking at that covered-up door outline. We went to bed at around 11 o'clock, I think, and the bed was sort of positioned so that the hidden wall space was directly behind our heads, and the giant wardrobe sat across the room, right in our line of sight. Because we'd been walking around the historic district all day, my fiancée fell asleep almost instantly, and I, on the other hand, woke up at exactly midnight. My breathing was shallow, and my skin felt incredibly hot. That exact same sensation from earlier, too. The feeling of a physical person standing over me was screaming through my nervous system. I kept my eyes squeezed shut for a few seconds, terrified of what I'd see if I looked up. Slowly, though, I opened my eyes, just a crack. The wardrobe door was open again, just a few inches, but that wasn't what made my throat lock up. You see, crouched flat on the very top of the wardrobe, wedged into the tight space between the wood and the ceiling, was a figure. It looked like a person wearing a loose white cotton smock, long matted black hair hanging down over the edge of the wood, completely obscuring their face, but I could see 2 stark white hands gripping the edge of the cabinet door, the knuckles completely white, and it was looking right down at the bed. My sudden ragged breathing ended up waking my fiancée. She rolled over and asked what was wrong. My voice was a completely flat whisper, but I told her exactly what was sitting on top of the wardrobe. She looked across the room, but couldn't see anything in the dark. Seeing how badly I was shaking, though, she reached over and flipped the switch on the bedside lamp, and the second that the light hit the top of the wardrobe, the figure, it didn't run or fade away. It just vanished, like a glitch in a video file. Like, one frame it was there, and the next it was just empty dust on the top of the wood. The transition was really weird, instant and physical. We kept the lamp on, and I eventually drifted back into a light sleep out of sheer exhaustion. An hour later, though, I snapped awake again. The lamp was still burning, but the bedroom felt freezing cold. The dread was 10 times worse this time, too. My chest felt so tight that I could barely draw air, and I was lying on my side facing the wall, and without moving my head, I sort of reached back to make sure my fiancée was still there. My hand brushed her shoulder. She was fast asleep, but there was something else. I could feel the physical displacement of air right behind my back. Someone was standing at the edge of the mattress, leaning directly over my side of the bed. I was convinced of it. The sensation was so close too that I could feel the invisible weight of the long hair hanging just an inch above my cheek. I knew with absolute certainty that if I turned my head, my face would slam right into whatever that thing was. I let out a sharp sort of choked gasp, which woke my fiancée up again. She immediately realized that I was paralyzed. I whispered to her that the woman was standing right next to my pillow. She scrambled out of the opposite side of the bed and flipped the main light switch on the wall, flooding the entire room with bright overhead light. And the weight above my face instantly lifted. The room was completely empty. We spent the rest of the night sitting upright with every single light in the apartment turned on. The sun came up at 6 a.m. and we packed our bags and locked the key back in the box without saying a word to each other. I haven't had anything like that happen to me since we got back to our place, and, well, we're getting married next month. I still don't know what to make of that experience, but I was so sure at the time that something was there. Three years ago, my roommate Elias and I were in that awkward, frantic 2-week limbo between leases. We'd moved our gear out of our old place, but we couldn't get into the new one yet, so we crashed in a generic, cheap studio rental that we found through an app. It was a single open-concept box in a massive apartment complex. The layout was incredibly cramped. You opened the front door and the queen-sized bed was right there to your left practically, maybe 4 feet from the threshold. Straight ahead was a tiny galley-style kitchenette with barely enough room for one person to stand, and then a door off to the right led to a shoebox bathroom. The place felt exposed and hollow, and it sat on the ground floor, right next to the complex's main walkway, so you would constantly hear the muffled sound of neighbors walking their dogs or having muffled conversations on their phones just inches from our single window. Quite honestly, it felt less like a home and more like a transparent cage. Elias was a total night owl though, always up until like 3 a.m, while I usually knocked out by about 11. I was dead asleep too when I felt a hand clamp down hard on my shoulder and sort of jerk me up. It wasn't a nudge, it was a violent, urgent pull, and Elias was sitting bolt upright next to me. He was completely rigid, his eyes locked in a dead-eyed stare at the kitchen doorway. He didn't look like he was having a nightmare. He looked like he was watching a live-action event. I sat up, my heart sort of jittering for a moment. Elias, what's wrong? He didn't blink. He just whispered, "Someone just walked in." I looked at the front door and it was bolted shut. I looked at the floor space between the bed and the kitchenette. What? Who? Did you hear somebody come in? I didn't hear a sound, he said, his voice terrifyingly flat. I was staring at my phone and a man just walked through the front door. He walked right past the bed, within arm's reach of us, and stepped into the kitchen over there. Elias is the most detached, non-reactive person that I had ever met. He's the kind of guy who wouldn't even flinch if a car crashed through our fence. To see him that pale and locked in made my stomach drop out of my body. I reached into the nightstand, grabbing a hunting knife that I kept in my gear, and climbed out of my bed. My hands were shaking so hard that I could barely grip the handle, but the apartment was so small that if somebody was standing in the kitchen, we were basically face to face. I took one step, cleared the bed, and lunged toward the kitchenette. I slammed my hand onto the wall switch, flooding the space with light, but nothing. The cupboards were shut, the trash can was empty. I pushed the bathroom door open, and it was just as silent and empty as the rest of the room. I stood there in the middle of that tiny sterile studio, holding a knife and feeling like a complete idiot in the quiet. I turned back to Elias, expecting him to be relieved or embarrassed. He was still staring at the kitchen floor, his expression never changing. He just gave a small, resigned shrug. "I know what I saw," he said. He wasn't trying to argue with me. He just seemed to have accepted it. And it was that absolute cold certainty is what really terrified me more than the initial grab even. I spent the next hour dragging the heavy dresser away from the wall, checking the floorboards and feeling around the perimeter of the door frame. I was looking for loose panels or crawl spaces or a hidden entry point like something out of a horror movie, but I was exhausted and my hands wouldn't stop shaking and I didn't find anything. But I also didn't feel safe enough to close my eyes again that night. We hauled our gear out of there at 6 in the morning, the second the sun hit the parking lot. And I still have no idea what happened. Sometimes I tell myself that Elias fell into a micro-sleep while scrolling and must have had a hallucination that bled into reality, but other times when I'm lying in my current apartment, I remember the look on his face and the way that he didn't even try to convince me. He just knew that somebody had walked right past our pillows. Whether it was a physical intruder who knew a way in or something that didn't follow the laws of our reality, I'm just glad that I didn't actually see what he saw. I've spent the last 3 years pouring glasses and clearing tables at a relatively popular event venue just outside of Grand Rapids, Michigan. When you work hospitality, you develop a bit of a thick skin pretty quickly. You get used to the loud talkers, the messy drunks, and the guys who think that tipping an extra $5 means that they own a piece of your time. I've had my share of uncomfortable interactions, but there was one Saturday night in October of 2023 that completely short-circuited my usual customer service brain. We were hosting a massive, high-end wedding reception in our main pavilion room. By 10:30 in the evening, the open bar had been flowing for hours, the bass from the DJ speakers were vibrating through the floorboards, and the staff was running on pure caffeine. I was working the middle station of the main mahogany bar, slamming glassware into the sanitizer tray, when this guy walked up. He looked completely harmless, at first at least. Maybe early 30s, clean-shaven, wearing a tailored navy suit that probably cost more than my monthly rent. But while my coworker took his drink order, he leaned against the brass railing and started making small talk with me about how busy the venue was. He was charismatic, sharp, and actually made me laugh a couple of times. He asked if I was the house manager running the floor, which felt like a weirdly specific question, but I just shrugged it off and pointed to my custom brass name tag. "Ah, Clara," he said, reading the print. Then, without any warning or shift in his expression, he reached his right hand completely across the bar top, palm up, inches from my apron. "Look at this," he murmured. Because we'd just been joking about the chaotic kitchen staff, I honestly assumed he was about to show me a deep scar from a glass breakage or a weird burn from a catering tray or something. He kept his eyes locked on mine and said, "Hold it." I was confused, but the hospitality instinct to keep the guest happy is a pretty powerful thing, let me tell you. So I reached out and put my hand in his, expecting him to drop a coin or show me a trick maybe. Instead, his fingers closed around mine, He wasn't squeezing hard at all. It was an incredibly soft and warm, almost limp grip. But he just held it there, suspended over the sticky wood of the bar. He didn't pump his arm for a handshake. He just kept his skin pressed against mine, tilted his head slightly, and said, "Feels right, doesn't it?" A cold and heavy prickle instantly broke out across the back of my neck. The casual, fun atmosphere of the bar dissolved in a split second. The boundary had been totally obliterated. I let out a nervous, high-pitched laugh, trying to gently pull my wrist back, but his fingers tightened just enough to keep me anchored. The music was blasting a remix of some pop song, but he leaned in further, his breath smelling heavily of bourbon. I couldn't catch the first half of his sentence over the treble, but the tail end of it came through clear as ice. Or I could just vault this wood and kiss you right now. My jaw, it went pretty tight. I couldn't breathe properly for a second. Before I could even process the threat, his eyes flicked upward toward the ceiling joists. "Oh, but wait," he whispered, a strange, rigid smile spreading across his face. "There are cameras." I forced my voice to stay deadpan, desperate to use whatever leverage I had to get my hand back. Yes, there are 3 HD lenses right above my register, actually, staring directly at your face." In reality, those specific domes had not been wired into a recording deck since the venue changed ownership in 2019, but he didn't know that. My co-workers were less than 4 feet away on either side of me, but they were completely consumed by the ticket printer and the noise of the blender. They had no idea what he was whispering. He didn't let go of my fingers. "Meet me out by the gravel valet loop in 10 minutes, he said, his voice dropping into a demanding and sort of flat tone. Yeah, okay, I'll be out there," I lied instantly. My brain was in pure survival mode. I probably would have agreed to anything just to break physical contact. He looked at me, his eyes narrowing into tiny slits. "You're probably lying to me, aren't you?" "I'm not. I'll meet you by the pines," I said, my teeth practically chattering from the sudden rush of adrenaline. He finally released his grip, grabbed his gin and tonic from my coworker, and walked backward into the crowd without taking his eyes off of me. The second that his back turned, though, I leaned over to the girl on the register next to me and hissed, "That guy in the navy suit is a complete psycho. He just threatened me." Which I didn't mention above, but he actually had threatened me at this stage. I looked past her toward the large double-paned glass windows that overlooked the outdoor smoking patio directly behind the bar, and there he was. He had walked straight outside, pressed his face almost against the glass, and was staring through the dark reflection directly at the back of my head. My lungs felt empty. I told the other staff that I was taking an unannounced 5-minute break and bolted up the back service stairwell toward the upper office. Halfway up the stairs, I ran into Brenda, the senior floor manager. I was talking so fast that the words were sort of overlapping, explaining that a wedding guest was stalking me through the glass. Brenda just looked annoyed, but she promised that she'd stay near the main till for the final half an hour of the night to keep an eye out. I stayed upstairs until the clock hit midnight, and the DJ finally announced last call. When I came back down, the pavilion was a disaster area. Empty champagne flutes everywhere, crumpled napkins and half-eaten cake. The man was no longer at the window, and the room was slowly clearing out as the shuttle buses arrived. I started working the floor with another backhouse kid, dragging the heavy linen cloths off of the round tables and folding them into the laundry bins. The lights had been raised to full brightness at this stage, which usually makes a venue feel safe and sterile again. The kid that I was working with, and I, were standing near the dark corner of the buffet alcove, silently folding a massive white sheet between us. When suddenly, 2 large, heavy hands clamped down firmly onto my bare upper arms from behind. A breathy, humid voice scraped right against my earlobe. "You left me hanging out by the cars, Clara." I didn't see a face. My brain didn't register a human being, in fact. The physical shock of the contact caused a sound to rip out of my throat. I absolutely shrieked. My legs moved before I could tell them to, and I dropped the linen and twisted out of his grip and sprinted 20 feet across the hardwood toward the center of the room where Brenda was counting the till. I refused to look back, but behind me, I heard the heavy, mocking chuckle of the man in the suit. "Geez, lady," he shouted, his voice echoing in the empty hall. "That is one heck of a pair of lungs." The weirdest part was that because the room was so vast and people were talking loudly near the exit, almost nobody noticed the scream, except for the kid that I was working with and the guy himself. Brenda looked up from her paperwork, though, completely unfazed, and asked me if I could finish the trash rotation in the lobby. Her total lack of concern made me feel instantly embarrassed too, like I was some hysterical little kid who had overreacted to a drunk guy playing a prank or something. The man thankfully didn't approach me again. He collected his coat from the lobby rack and vanished into the final shuttle bus 5 minutes later. But that terror didn't leave my system for some time. I clocked out at 1:30, walked out to the parking lot with my keys wedged between my knuckles, and unlocked my car. And even though I knew that he had boarded a bus filled with like 30 other people, his voice was looping in my head so vividly that it felt like he was sitting in the dark. I physically climbed into my back seat, checked around the car, and shined my phone flashlight into the trunk floor before I even put the key in the ignition. I have served hundreds of creepy men since that night, but there was something about this guy that just felt completely off. I will never forget the absolute helplessness of realizing, too, that some people just do not care about cameras, managers, or a room full of witnesses if they decide that they want to put their hands on you. I'm 20 years old now, but this happened around 2015, back when my family lived in a hollowed-out timber town in the Pacific Northwest. The kind of place with one flashing yellow light, an old lumber co-op, a tiny volunteer fire station, and a dirt lot chevron. Because the population was barely triple digits, our parents had this deep, stubborn illusion of safety. They thought that nothing could happen in a town where everybody knew your granddad. It was a suffocatingly hot July afternoon as well, and my 12-year-old cousin, my 9-year-old friend, and I decided to set up a folding table at the end of a long gravel driveway to sell some homemade popsicles and some sweet tea to passing loggers. Because my cousin was 12, our parents considered her the responsible adult in charge while they drove an hour out to the nearest Walmart for some supplies. Around 8 o'clock, the sky was getting dark, the air was dead quiet, and we were counting our quarters into a metal cookie tin, getting ready to pack it in, when a rusted primer grey sedan pulled off the asphalt. The car didn't park by the table as well. It pulled completely onto the grass shoulder, its engine idling with a heavy broken knocking sound. The second, too, that the car stopped, my friend's cattle dog, a pretty big 60-pound blue heeler that usually slept through literal thunderstorms, snapped awake. The hair along his spine stood straight up like a wire brush, and he let out this low, vibrating growl from the back of his throat that I had never heard him use before. A guy opened the driver's door and stepped out. He was tall, thin, and had a shock of bright curly orange hair. What struck out immediately, though, was his shirt. It was a crisp neon blue charity t-shirt that said "Support Local Youth" in big block letters, but it looked brand new, almost like it had just been pulled out of plastic wrap. He had his left hand rammed deep into his jean pockets, and his right hand was hovering awkwardly at his side. My 9-year-old friend, completely oblivious, smiled and asked if he wanted a sweet tea. The man didn't answer. He just stared at the three of us, his eyes moving from our faces down to the cash tin on the table. He took a heavy step forward, grabbed a plastic cup of tea from the table, and downed it in 3 massive mechanical gulps. Then he slammed the empty plastic cup onto the wooden table so hard that it cracked down the middle. By now, the healer was going absolutely berserk. He was straining against his chain, his teeth bared, frantically lunging forward toward the man's left pocket. Without a single trace of anger on his face, completely expressionless, the man lashed out his boot and kicked the dog squarely in the ribs. The dog let out a sharp yelp and scrambled back under the porch stairs. My cousin's face went totally pale, but my friend and I were so young and sheltered that we just froze, completely unable to process why a nice charity man would do something like that. The man looked back at us, his jaw twitching. "I don't actually care about the tea," he said. His voice was incredibly flat, like he was reading off of a script. "Oh," my cousin said, her voice dropping an octave. "Okay." He pointed a long, pale finger across the 2-lane highway toward the edge of the woods, where the collapsed, blackened ruins of an old Methodist parsonage sat behind an overgrown briar patch. The place, it had been gutted by a fire in the 90s, I think, and was totally abandoned, choked with weeds and warning signs. "My vehicle's alternator is failing," the man said, staring directly at a 9-year-old. "I need to plug my portable diagnostic scanner into a high-voltage exterior outlet. I see an old utility pole over by that ruined parish across the road. Let's all walk over there together right now and see if the breaker box still has live power." Even at 9, I was obsessed with my dad's garage tools, and I knew for a fact that you couldn't just plug an automotive scanner into a standard wooden utility pole. And there wasn't a live wire within a mile of that charred old lot anyway. He took another step around the table, his left hand still buried deep into his pocket, pressing into the fabric in a way that looked heavy and angular. "Come on, show me the way across the grass." My 12-year-old cousin didn't hesitate. She stepped right between us and the man, grabbing the collar of my shirt. "Actually," she said, her voice remarkably loud and steady, "my older brother just got home from his shift at the state prison, and he's inside cleaning his hunting rifles. Let me go grab him from the kitchen. He's a mechanic. He'd love to come out here and look at your engine." The shift in the man's demeanor was instantaneous. The second that she mentioned an adult male inside the house, his fake polite posture just evaporated. He didn't say another word, in fact. He spun on his heel, threw himself back into the driver's seat of the grey sedan, and slammed the door. The tires tore up the grass shoulder as he violently reversed back into the highway and sped off toward the edge of town. Our parents weren't going to be home for like another 2 hours, so we went inside and we locked the deadbolts and all the doors, but because we were stupid, bored kids, the confinement made us restless after 30 minutes. So we convinced ourselves the danger was gone, and so we decided to walk the 1/4 mile down the gravel shoulder to the Chevron station to buy blue raspberry slushies. The sun had completely set by the time that we had reached the gas station lot. The overhead canopy lights were buzzing loudly in the dark, and as we reached the glass doors, I noticed a vehicle parked in the furthest unlit corner of the lot, right next to the kerosene tank. It was the grey sedan. The engine was cut, and all 4 windows were rolled completely down. Inside the car, the man was sitting perfectly still in the dark, but he had changed out of his bright blue charity shirt. He was now wearing a thick, black, heavy-duty hoodie. He had the hood pulled so far down over his brow and the drawstrings yanked so incredibly tight that his entire skull was encased in the black fabric. The only thing visible through the tiny pinched open of the hood was his bright orange hair bursting out of the top like a flame, and the pale, grinning reflection of his teeth. It was horrifying to look at. He was staring directly through the side mirror, seemingly at us. The moment that our eyes met his, he let out this horrific, high-pitched, wheezing laugh that sounded like a wet throat clearing itself accompanied by a wide, rigid smirk. He didn't move his head. He just slowly raised his right hand, which was now holding a heavy black tire iron, and tapped it against the inside of the steering wheel. My cousin didn't even say a word. She lunged forward, grabbed the fabric of my t-shirt and my friend's collar in her fists, and yanked us backwards so hard that we nearly hit the gravel. "Run," she choked out. I have never felt my legs move like that in my life before or since then. We didn't run back toward the empty house, mind you. We bolted straight down the middle of the dark asphalt highway, our sneakers slapping against the yellow lines, screaming at the top of our lungs. We ran 3 solid blocks too, until we saw the green glow of a county sheriff's cruiser idling outside of the local Grange Hall. We practically threw ourselves against the driver's side door of that police car too, sobbing and screaming about the man with the orange hair and the tire iron. The deputy was incredibly patient. He threw us into the back seat, turned on his high beams and drove straight back to the Chevron. The corner by the kerosene tank was completely empty now though. The man was gone. The deputy escorted us into our house, checked all the window latches from the inside, and stayed parked at the bottom of our driveway with his headlights on, until our parents' headlights finally pulled into the gravel at like midnight, I think it was. They got a bit of a stern talking to from that police officer, which I was thankful for because after that, things changed a bit. But I still think about that support the youth shirt all the time, and how perfectly he had calculated that disguise to target 3 naive kids sitting by a gravel road like that. But more than anything, I remember the heavy, angular weight shifting in his pocket when he tried to get us to walk into those dark woods. I know with every single cell in my body that if my cousin hadn't have lied about the brother inside, we would have been dragged into that patch, and the cookie tin full of quarters, it would have been the only thing left at that table. So I work as a night shift monitoring technician for a regional water treatment utility in Maine. The job is mostly terminal boredom, really. It's a vast brick and corrugated iron facility situated about 4 miles outside of town, surrounded by nothing but pine forest and marshland. On any given night, too, I'm the only human being within miles of this place, responsible for logging fluid levels and checking pipe pressures every few hours. Last November, we had a torrential storm that knocked out the main transformer grid, forcing the facility to run entirely on its emergency diesel generators. The storm was deafening too, hammering against the corrugated roof like handfuls of gravel, and because the power flickered during the transition to the generator, the facility's external security monitors went totally dark. The only thing that I had to rely on was a secondary low-voltage control panel in the central laboratory. Now, around 2 in the morning, I was sitting at the metal desk, checking the diagnostic terminal, when a pressure drop alarm began to chime on the secondary filtration system. The readout indicated a manual bypass valve had been opened down in the pump basement. That particular valve, it required a physical wrench to turn it. It couldn't be triggered by a computer glitch or a power surge or anything, which meant that someone or something had physically turned the heavy iron wheel. I began to get a bit of a bad feeling about this, but I convinced myself that it had to be a mechanical failure, a seal blowing out under the pressure of the storm runoff. I grabbed a flashlight and my tool belt, stepping out of the pressurized office and heading down the concrete utility corridor toward the basement stairs. The facility was pitch black, except for the rotating yellow emergency beacons casting some sickening shadows against the brick walls. But as I reached the top of the metal grid stairs leading down into the pump vault, I stopped dead in my tracks. The heavy pressurized hum of the pumps was pretty normal, but beneath the noise, I heard a sort of weird sound. It sounded like somebody was walking through the shallow puddle at the base of the stairs. I leaned over the steel handrail and shone the beam of my light straight down. The light cut through the darkness and landed directly on a person standing right next to the main intake line. He was drenched from the storm, wearing a heavy mud-slicked coat. He had a thick, unkempt white beard that was sort of stained yellowish around his mouth, and his eyes were wide and bloodshot and completely devoid of any sanity. He was standing there, holding a rusted 3-foot crowbar, staring up into the light beam. When the light hit his face, he didn't flinch too. Instead, he just sort of smiled at me. He then took a heavy step toward the stairs, the metal tip of the crowbar scraping loudly against the concrete floor. I dropped the flashlight by accident. It shattered on the metal grate, plunging the stairwell into semi-darkness almost instantly. I scrambled backward into the utility corridor, my work boots slick, and I bolted down the hall toward the main administrative hub. I needed to reach the communication desk to patch an emergency line out to the state police barracks, but the main office had massive uncurtained glass observation windows that overlooked the entire central corridor. If I went in there, then I would be completely visible to anybody walking down that hall. So instead, I ducked into the emergency chemical containment locker at the very end of the hall, a tiny windowless room with a heavy reinforced steel security door meant to contain chlorine gas leaks. The room, it had a small thick glass peep slit in the center of the door that gave a straight line view down the entire length of the corridor. I slammed the heavy steel latch down, locking myself inside the absolute dark of the locker. I suddenly noticed that my breath felt short and ragged. I pressed my eye against the cold glass of the peep slit. The rotating yellow beacon in the hallway flickered on and off, and in the brief flashes of the light, I watched the man turn the corner from the stairwell. He wasn't rushing, he was looking down at the floor. Because I had just walked through some oil and the water near the pump room, my work boots had left a perfect dark trail of greasy footprints on the pristine light grey epoxy floor of the corridor. The tracks, they led directly to the base of the chemical locker door. He followed the prints, and he stopped exactly on the last footprint, right in front of my door. Suddenly, his face slammed against the small glass peep slit. He was staring straight through the glass, his bloodshot eyes inches from mine, though he couldn't see into the unlit locker, I think. He began to slam the crowbar against the heavy steel door. The sound inside the enclosed space was deafening too, rattling through my teeth. The internal landline phone was out on the main desk in the observation office, though, at least 20 feet away. My cell phone was sitting right next to it as well, plugged into the charger, and I knew that if I didn't get to that phone, that nobody was coming for me, at least until 6 o'clock in the morning, when the shift changed. And even then, if this guy wasn't gone by then, well, somebody else could get hurt. I waited for a brief pause in the hammering, and then I threw the latch door open, sprinted out into the corridor, and dove through the office door. The man literally screamed at me and lunged after me as well. I grabbed the cell phone from the desk, seeing the white reflection of his face through the observation glass as he smashed the window with the crowbar. Shards of safety glass began raining down onto the desk as I scrambled back into the hallway and threw myself back into the chemical locker, slamming the steel latch shut just as his heavy boot kicked the outside of the door. I fell to my knees in the dark, frantically dialing 911. My fingers were trembling so violently that I missed the numbers twice in the end. The operator, though, came on eventually, her calm, robotic voice a bizarre contrast to the violence outside all of a sudden. The man, though, was no longer hitting the door. He was now throwing his entire body weight against it, screaming unintelligibly, and just cursing over the roar of the storm. The steel frame of the locker door began to warp a little bit too, the top bolt groaning as it started to pull away from the masonry. For 40 endless minutes as well, I braced my back against that reinforced metal, my legs literally locked onto the back wall, feeling every single impact vibrate through my spine and wondering why this guy wasn't getting tired. Then, the piercing wail of a state trooper siren cut through the thunder outside. high-intensity spotlights flooded the facility high windows, casting bright white lines across the corridor. The pounding on my door stopped instantly. Through the steel, I heard the echoing shouts of 3 troopers, the chaotic shuffle of heavy boots on wet concrete, and the sharp clinking sound of handcuffs. When the troopers finally cleared the buildings and let me out, they showed me what they had found in the back of the man's rusted pickup truck, which he had hidden in the tree line behind our perimeter fence. The bed of the truck contained several rolls of industrial duct tape, a tarpaulin, and a collection of hunting knives. The state investigators later revealed that the guy was apparently an escaped inpatient from a secure forensic psychiatric unit 2 counties over, who had been drifting through the state forest for a week at least. He also had not come to steal copper wire or anything like that. He had been watching the facility's lights from the woods, waiting for a night when he could cut me off from the world. And the storm, he thought that it was his calling or something like that, a message from the gods or something to come and end me. I quit the utility company the very next week. I work a desk job in a bright, crowded insurance office now, surrounded by people and sunlight pretty much all day. But every time the power flickers, especially during a heavy storm, my body just instantly remembers the cold metal of that chemical locker and the sound of a rusted crowbar searching for me in the dark, and I always freeze up a little bit. So I work as a seasonal hand on a commercial salmon trawler, running drift nets out of a bleak wind-scoured port in Prince William Sound, Alaska. It's hard, isolating work, and the guys who stick around for more than 2 seasons are usually running from something. Debt, ex-wives, or just the noise of the lower 48. 2 winters ago, though, I was crewing with a veteran deckhand named Isaac. He was in his late 40s, a massive quiet guy with leathery skin who lived entirely out of a canvas duffel bag. When he wasn't on watch, Isaac didn't drink or play cards like the rest of the crew. He sat in the lower berthing quarters, reading heavy grease-stained textbooks on deep-sea biology, archaic maritime superstitions, and old Norwegian folklore about the Draugr, the spirits of drowned sailors or something, supposed to haunt the kelp beds or something like that. He didn't talk much though, but when he did, he spoke about the ocean like it was conscious, a breathing neighbor that was actively watching us through the hull. It was mid-November, and we were tied up at a rotten timber fuel dock near an unpopulated inlet, waiting out a massive North Pacific gale. The rest of the crew had taken the skiff into a settlement 5 miles away to hit the taverns, leaving Isaac and me alone to monitor the bilge pumps. Around 3 o'clock in the morning, the wind died down to a low, hollow whistle, and I was up in the wheelhouse, making coffee when Isaac came up the ladder. He sat on the bench, completely expressionless, staring out into the black, oily water of the bay. He told me that 20 minutes prior, he had been down in the narrow mechanical crawl space right beneath the forward bait lockers, a cramped iron-ribbed compartment where the auxiliary bilge lines run. It's a dead and freezing space that smells of diesel and old salt. While he was checking the pressure gauges, the heavy counterweighted steel latch on the primary bait locker apparently slowly lifted itself. The heavy lid swung open against the bulkhead with a dull clunk, stayed upright for 5 seconds, and then dropped shut, the latch clicking back into place. Most guys would have assumed a rogue swell had rocked the hull, or the hinges were loose or something. But Isaac didn't blink. He told me that he stood up in the narrow space, his head pressed against the cold iron deckheads, looked directly at the corners of the locker room, and spoke aloud into the noise of the generator. "I know the displacement changed when we loaded the winter diesel," he said into the dark. "If you're going to foul the lines, just do it now while the tools are out." He said the air in the compartment instantly turned heavy, dropping 3 or 4 degrees until his breath plumed white in the flashlight beam. He leaned against the iron bulkhead and said, "If you're just shifting with the tide, scratch the hull. If you're something else, give me a real weight." The second the words left his mouth, a sound tore through the auxiliary exhaust pipe right next to his ear. He described it as an agonizing, heavy rattling sound, like a grown man thick with seawater trying to draw a breath through fluid-filled lungs. It was a suffocating, choking wheeze that vibrated directly through the iron plate that he was leaning against. Then the engine room went completely dead silent again. When I asked him, shivering in the bright light of the wheelhouse, if he thought the ship was haunted by the guy who had been overboard off the stern 2 seasons ago, Isaac just shook his head. He had this unsettling, flat calm in his eyes that made the skin on my forearms tighten up. "It's not a ghost," he murmured, his voice completely level. "It's just the ballast." He explained that old fishermen in the northern ports believe that when a wooden vessel spends 40 years soaking in deep cold water, the iron in the timber eventually absorbs something from the dark floor of the shelf. They call it the unseen freight, a secondary weight that hitches a ride in the hollow spaces between the fuel bladers and the keel. They don't belong to the dead, they're just ancient physical things that consider the dark, wet interior of the ship to be their territory, and they violently resent a new crew coming in and changing the draft. At least, that's what he told me. We finished the season 3 weeks later. Isaac took his canvas duffel, caught a ferry, and I never saw him again. But I haven't been back on a commercial boat since then, too. The terrifying part of that night, though, wasn't the sound in the pipe or the locker lid moving on its own, as he said it did. It was the fact that Isaac, he just wasn't afraid at all. He lived with that heavy, choking rattle in the dark for so long, I guess, that he just treated it like nothing more than a leaky valve. I work as a land surveyor for a pipeline company out in West Texas. Most of our jobs involve mapping out rights-of-way through deep, trackless scrubland, miles of empty desert where the limestone shelves are so hot that the air constantly shimmers above the brush. It's pretty lonely work, and you spend all day dragging a 60-pound pack across completely empty land. But back in May of 2022, I was running a boundary line through a remote sandstone draw near the Pecos River. The heat was pushing 104 degrees, and by mid-afternoon, the horizon was just a blurry, white-hot mess. I had 2 college interns with me who were driving the wooden stakes into the hard dirt while I operated the GPS rig. On our way back to the truck, our path crossed the remains of an old collapsed building out in the middle of nowhere. It was just a flat concrete foundation with rusted rebar sticking out of the weeds. The interns wanted to detour over to check it out, thinking that it might be an old oil well cap or an early homestead or something. As we got within about 50 yards of the concrete pad, this incredibly heavy pressure dropped over the area. The normal sound of the desert wind just completely died out all of a sudden, and it was replaced by a mumbling sound right inside of my ear. It sounded like a man leaning in close and whispering directly to me, but I couldn't make out what was being said. The weird thing, though, was that I wasn't really too scared. I didn't get that sudden hit of adrenaline that you hear about when something like this happens. Instead, this massive wave of, familiarity washed over me, like I had spent years in this exact spot, even though I'd never been to this county in my life. The whispering in my ear started sounding sweet and inviting even. It kept telling me, or what I could perceive of it, that this house had been built specifically for me, that it was so glad that I was back and that I needed to walk over and stand on the concrete right now. And look, I know that sounds absolutely crazy, but that's just what happened. So I started walking towards the ruins with these heavy robotic steps, my eyes completely locked on the rusted metal. I felt like I was moving through thick mud as well, and I was totally out of it. One of the interns suddenly grabbed my shoulder though and yanked me back. She looked really creeped out and told me that the ground around the foundation was completely full of old snake holes, and that we needed to get back to the truck before it got dark. I tried to argue with her, but my voice apparently was flat and weird, like it belonged to somebody else, is what she said. I kept telling her, though, that we had to go into the house, but both interns refused. They grabbed the straps of my backpack and, in the end, physically forced me to turn around and walk back down the gravel trail. The second, though, that we turned our backs on that place, the whispering that I kept hearing turned completely furious. I felt this sharp, heavy pressure press right into the palm of my right hand as well, like a cold, rough hand had reached out, grabbed my fingers, and was trying to squeeze them to lock me in place. I kept dragging my boots forward, crying out that I had to go back, while the pulling on my hand got so hard that my knuckles actually popped. When we got back to the truck and I threw my gear into the back, the feeling didn't stay behind in the desert. It didn't feel like it was standing next to me anymore, though. It felt like it had slid right inside of my skin, like a cold, solid lump wedged directly between my ribs and my lungs. As we pulled onto the highway and started driving quickly, the whispering inside of my head turned into like a loud screaming. I was losing my mind over this too. The farther that we got from that concrete foundation, the more it seemed to squeeze inside of my chest. It felt like a pair of hands had grabbed onto my actual heart and was violently yanking it backward toward the rear window, trying to tear it out of me. The pain was so bad as well that apparently I passed out. According to the interns, I started shaking uncontrollably in the passenger seat, tearing at my shirt and screaming that somebody was ripping my heart out through the seat back. The driver pulled the truck over onto the shoulder immediately. She had done some EMT training before this job, and seeing me hysterically crying and shaking and hyperventilating like this genuinely terrified her. Eventually, though, I settled, according to them, and for the next 2 hours, while we drove back to the main office, my brain just completely short-circuited. I was totally convinced that my chest was empty and that my heart had stopped beating. No matter how hard I pressed my fingers against my wrist or my chest, I couldn't feel a single pulse. I was begging my older intern to check it for me, and even when she held my hand and told me that she felt a steady heartbeat, I didn't believe her. I thought that she was lying to keep me calm. When we finally got back to the shop, our supervisor brought out a medical kit and put a blood pressure cuff on my arm. Seeing the actual needle jump and my pulse was the only thing that broke the panic and allowed my lungs to open up again. It's almost 1 a.m. now, and the rest of the crew is asleep in the field trailers. I'm sitting up in the tool shed, frantically Googling ghost stories on my phone to see if this happened to anybody else. I'm sort of exhausted, but every time that I close my eyes lately, my right palm starts to tingle a little bit, and I sort of feel that cold, heavy weight waiting inside of my chest again. And now I'm struggling to sleep, and so here I am, trying to get answers to whatever this was. In the summer of 2018, my buddy and I were driving across eastern Oregon on our way to a music festival. Around 2 o'clock in the morning, our old vehicle started overheating, forcing us to pull off the main highway onto this pitch-black gravel turnout right next to an old abandoned pioneer cemetery and a collapsed wooden hall. There was absolutely no cell service here, no street lights, and nothing but miles of empty sagebrush around. We were sitting on the hood of the car, waiting for the radiator to cool down, when we heard this bizarre noise coming from the dirt road further up the hill. At first, it sounded like it was a mile away, just a sort of crunching of the gravel, dozens of low, muffled murmurs, and the distinct sound of a massive crowd shuffling through the dark. But it kept moving in a straight line toward our car. It sounded exactly like a huge line of people walking shoulder to shoulder in the dark, coming from the old hall and heading straight toward the cemetery gates. There had to be 50 or 60 people moving together in the pitch black like that too. And then, right where this sound was coming from, was an old rusted farm flatbed. But it wasn't moving right. Instead of bumping and rattling over the deep ruts in the dirt, like a heavy wooden wagon should, it just sort of glided smoothly through the darkness without making a single sound. There was no rev of the engine, no creaking from the axle, no wheels turning in the dirt, just a massive heavy shape sliding effortlessly through the dust. My buddy was looking through his phone camera, trying to use the digital screen to see if he could amplify the moonlight and catch a glimpse of what was coming down the road. My friend got this instant violent wave of nausea all of a sudden. He sort of scrambled backward over the windshield, jumped into the passenger seat and slammed the lock down. I dived into the driver's seat right behind him and I locked my door. We peeled out of there pretty quickly and neither of us looked out the windows or touched the doors for like the next hour, even though the car cabin got boiling hot. But eventually, by morning, the radiator had cooled down enough for us to limp the car to a gas station, and when we got there, we finally spoke about what the heck that was. Neither of us had any idea as to how to explain any of it, and I've been looking online at forums to see if anyone else has seen anything like this. So if anyone here has heard of anything like this, then please do let me know, because this one has me completely baffled. A few years back, I was renting a small rundown cabin out in rural eastern Kentucky, right on the edge of Daniel Boone National Forest. I had taken a semester off from college to clear my head and was spending my time doing some amateur landscape photography. The cabin was dirt cheap as well, mostly because the plumbing was ancient and it was completely isolated at the end of a gravel logging track. The property sat in a deep sandstone draw though, and right behind the porch was this massive dead sycamore tree. In the daytime, it just looked like a piece of bleached wood, but at night, the grey branches looked like giant thin arms stretching over the metal roof. Whenever the mountain wind kicked up, the branches scraped against the tin as well, making this awful metallic screech. The guy who leased me the place, an old local named Miller, made a weird comment when I handed him the first month's cash. He told me to keep the back porch light on after midnight because people used to get lost in the drawer. He wouldn't explain what he meant, but the flat look in his eyes made my skin crawl a bit. The first 10 days were totally fine though. I set up a makeshift desk by the back window to edit my digital photos, drank a lot of coffee, and I got used to the silence pretty quickly. Then, one night at around 2:30 in the morning, I was sitting at the desk sorting through files on my laptop. The woods outside were pitch black, completely silent except for the wind. I sort of leaned back to stretch my neck and looked out the window into the draw. And at first I thought the moonlight was playing tricks on the mist rising off the creek, but there was a woman walking through the brush. She was heavily pregnant, moving with these unnaturally slow, deliberate steps through the briars. She was wearing a long, faded blue cotton dress that dragged through the dead leaves, and it just didn't make any sense. There were no other houses for miles. The ground was full of jagged rocks, and she was walking completely barefoot in the freezing mud, and she looked heavily pregnant. I just stared, completely stunned, thinking that maybe she must be a lost hiker from the park trail or something. The next night, too, it happened again. I was exhausted and about to shut down my laptop when this sudden heavy urge made me look up at the glass. It was exactly 2:45 in the morning, and she was standing right under the dead sycamore tree. In the darkness, too, apart from my computer screen, I could now see the pattern on her dress. It was a faded, old-fashioned floral print with tiny light blue flowers. One of her hands was resting flat over her stomach, holding her belly tightly like she was in pain. Her hair was incredibly long, thick and black, hanging down her back in mats. I sat completely locked into my chair, unable to even blink. Suddenly, though, she stopped walking. Very slowly, way too slowly, she rotated her neck and looked straight through the glass at me. Her face was totally pale, and her eyes were like two dark, empty holes with no light in them at all. The absolute despair coming off of her, though, made a wave of physical nausea hit my stomach. I got up out of my chair, slammed the heavy wooden window shutter closed, and I crawled straight into bed under the covers, thinking that I must be going crazy. That night, I had the most vivid, exhausting dream of my life, too. I saw a young couple inside of the house that looked exactly like my cabin, but the wood was new and clean. The woman was wearing the same blue floral dress, looking happy and expectant. Then the scene sort of shifted violently. The husband left down the road and the cabin turned dark and rotting. The dream ended with the view of the back drawer. The woman was standing on a wooden crate under the sycamore tree with a thick hempen rope. Her face twisted in this agonizing guilt, like she was screaming because she was ending two lives. I woke up, though, soaked in sweat, shivering so hard that my teeth were clicking. I packed my camera gear into my car that morning and I drove to the county library to look through old local newspapers on microfilm. I never did find anything, but I also didn't go back to the cabin. Thankfully, there was nothing else that happened after that, and I looked into some old town records, but I never did find anything about that woman in the blue dress. In June of 2017, my dad and a group of 5 other guys, they went down to rural southern Missouri for a 4-day backcountry packing trip through a heavily forested, rugged area near the 11-Point River. It's full of deep limestone sinkholes, thick oak timber, and some steep ridges where there's absolutely no cell service or paved roads for miles. Now, on the 3rd afternoon, they were hiking through a deep, isolated limestone hollow about maybe 4 miles from the main trail. The air was dead quiet, and the sun was starting to get low behind the ridge. Suddenly, the dirt beneath their boots started vibrating. My dad said that it wasn't a quick tremor like an earthquake or anything. It was slow, and it hit every 4 or 5 seconds, making the loose gravel in the dry creek bed visibly bounce. He said that the first thing that he thought of was heavy machinery, like a massive logging bulldozer tearing through the woods. But there weren't any access roads anywhere near this hollow. Because it felt so heavy and aggressive, though, the whole group got a little bit spooked, scrambled up the bank, and crouched down behind a massive pile of fallen logs to see what was coming down the draw. A few seconds later, a shape cleared the ridgeline about 200 yards away. Now, my dad swears on his life that it was a human figure, but it was easily 8 feet tall. It was walking along the upper ridge of the hollow. He said that the trees were blocking a lot of the direct view, but he could clearly see 2 massive pale legs moving through the timber with a heavy swinging stride. Every time that a foot hit the ground, the impact rattled the dry logs they were hiding behind. He was so terrified that his jaw locked up, and he just pressed his face into the dirt, praying that the thing wouldn't look down into the hollow. The figure just kept walking in a straight line, completely ignoring him, and disappeared over the next ridge. The whole group, they stayed pinned behind these logs for almost 40 minutes, completely paralyzed because they were terrified of bumping into it if they moved. 2 of the guys in the group, these younger, hot-headed cousins who had brought hunting rifles, actually started whispering about trying to track it and shoot it, thinking that it was some kind of an undiscovered monster that would make them famous. The oldest guy in the group immediately shut them down, though, calling them idiots and telling them to keep their mouths shut. As soon as they caught their breath, though, they hauled butt back to the trailhead, leaving half their camping gear behind, and drove straight to the ranger station. When they reported what they saw, the rangers completely laughed them off, and one of them told my dad that a local spotter plane had been flying over that exact grid section all afternoon looking for forest fires, and the pilot would have easily spotted a giant human shape walking through the trees like that. But all 6 guys in the group described the exact same thing. One of the cousins claimed the shape looked completely hairless and white, while another guy swore that it looked like it was wearing some kind of a dark, ragged grey cloth thing around its waist, but all of them, again, described the same thing. My dad always tells me that he didn't look long enough to see those details, but he just remembers the ground shaking, the terrifying weight of the footsteps, and the grey shape moving above the tree line. I've tried arguing with him about it too, telling him that a creature that massive would leave huge footprints, break thousands of tree branches, and eventually leave behind bones that somebody would find, especially in a state like Missouri where people hunt and hike everywhere. But he always just gives me this cold, dead serious look and says, "I don't know anything about bones, I just know that the ground shook and I know what I saw." I don't know what to think about it. It sounds completely insane, but my dad isn't a liar and he's never told a single ghost story in his life. Has anyone ever heard of anything like this happening in the deep woods? In October of 2023, I was driving through southeastern Colorado on my way back from a family visit. Around 5 p.m., I decided to take a bit of a detour to a state wildlife area out in the shortgrass prairie, miles away from the highway. I had read about the place online, and I really wanted to watch the sunset over the plains. By the time that I pulled up to the dirt access lot, the sun was sitting right on the horizon, and the main office trailer was completely locked up for the night. There wasn't a single person other than me there. The weather was perfect for just walking and thinking, though. The air was completely still, and it was a beautiful evening. I left my truck parked right in front of the locked gate and started walking down the main gravel trail that cut through the open prairie. After about 5 minutes of walking, I heard a car door slam back toward the entrance. I turned around and saw a dark sedan pulled up right behind my truck. A guy got out and started walking around my tailgate, looking closely at my plates. I figured that it was a local wildlife officer checking out my truck, and I thought about heading back to see if I needed to move, but I just didn't feel like dealing with all of that, and so I kept walking deeper into the field. The trail looped around a series of low ridges. It was a really nice walk in the end. I saw a few jackrabbits kicking around, and the mist gave the whole prairie this completely isolated and sort of lonely feel to it. I scrambled up to the highest point on the ridge in the end, which was about 50 feet above the flat plain. The view was incredible, and I spent about 20 minutes up there watching the very last of the daylight fade away. Since the air was so empty, I decided to shout out a loud hello into the open space just to hear the acoustics. The sound traveled miles across the grass, echoing right back at me. I did it again too, louder this time. By then, the darkness was really starting to drop, and I knew that I needed to get back to my truck before it got completely pitch black out here. Now, the second that I started walking down the dirt incline, the whole area suddenly got incredibly loud. The crickets and the cicadas in the grass went from a normal buzz to this intense heavy fall of sound over the span of a few seconds, like loud radio static filling the air. Right after that, an animal started making this bizarre deep howling sound in the bush below the ridge. I stopped on the path to listen for a bit. For the next 2 minutes, the howling kept going. It sounded like a large dog barking at first, but then it would stretch out into this long, agonizing wail that didn't sound right at all. I could point exactly to the patch where it was coming from, too. Then, just as fast as it had started, the howling stopped and the whole plain went dead quiet. I didn't want to use my phone flashlight because I wanted to enjoy the natural light, and honestly, I didn't want any park staff to spot me walking around after hours. To save some time, instead of taking the long gravel loop back, I sort of took a direct shortcut across a wide open clearing of short grass that led straight to the parking lot. As I was walking through that grass, I noticed a distinct rustling sound coming from the thick bushes on my left. Every time that I took a step, I'd hear something moving in the weeds too. When I stopped to look, the rustling would instantly stop. I tried to tell myself that it was just a deer or a badger keeping its distance, and I kept my eyes fixed straight ahead on my truck. I cleared that area and was out in the complete open flat, about 40 yards away from the parking lot gate. That's when another car came driving down the dirt road from the left, its headlights cutting through the thick fog. And that was the exact moment that I saw something. I caught a movement out of the corner of my eye in the short grass. At first glance, it looked like a tiny dark silhouette scurrying through the dirt, maybe a small feral cat or a raccoon or something. I kept walking, but I did a bit of a double take. The shape was moving incredibly quickly, parallel to the road, chasing after the car's taillights. But as I watched it, the silhouette started expanding. It grew into the size of like a medium dog, and then it stretched out further, getting longer and taller. My brain completely stalled out trying to process what I was actually looking at, when suddenly, its front legs lifted entirely off the ground. The thing stood up on two legs and kept running at full speed, its arms pinned tight to its sides. It looked like a massive top-heavy human shape sprinting through the fog, totally motionless from the waist up. It stayed like that for about 5 seconds as well. Then it took this massive, unnatural leap forward. Its limbs spread out wide in midair, and when it hit the ground, it dropped back down onto all fours. It went from like a complete human shape to this 7-foot-long gangly creature that looked like a cross between a grey wolf and a massive long-limbed primate. A second car came down the road from behind, and its high beams flashed directly across the open field. The light hit the creature perfectly for a split second as well. I saw light brown wire-coarse fur, a long thick tail like a wolf, and a heavily muscled, disjointed body. It was moving with this terrifying mechanical speed too, completely outrunning the car until it vanished into the dark past the road. The whole thing lasted maybe 20 seconds, I would say. I stood there completely frozen in the grass, my head spinning at what I was looking at. It almost looked like 5 different animals sort of all at once, but it didn't look like anything that belonged in those woods. The second that the lights disappeared, the reality of how isolated I was really slammed into me too. I pulled out my phone, dialed my cousin, and told him to stay on the line with me and keep talking until I reached my door. I had to walk straight across the patch of grass where that thing had been just running as well. Those last 50 feet to my truck were the longest seconds of my life, let me tell you. I was convinced that something was about to hit me from the dark fog before I could reach my car, but when I finally hit the key fob and saw the headlights flash, I practically threw myself into the driver's seat, slammed the locks down, and just started breathing in hard and ragged gasps. I tried to explain to my cousin on the phone what I had just seen, but the words sounded completely ridiculous. A dog-man-monkey thing that changed shape in the middle of a flat field. Yeah, I didn't do too well. Anyway, I drove straight to the nearest highway gas station, locked myself in the truck, and I started looking up local legends on my phone. I found old stories about frontier dogmen and regional shapeshifters from old prairie lore that did match the description that I saw. The weird disjointed running style, the car chasing, and the way that the body altered its shape while moving. I still have a voice memo on my phone from right before it happened even, where you can actually hear the crickets suddenly getting deafeningly loud right before the awful howling started. I really don't care what anyone says about tricks of the lights or wild dogs or whatever, because whatever ran across that flat field that night, I'm telling you, it was not normal. One summer a few years back, my cousin and I rented a cabin for a long weekend in an old logging town. It was in Grand Rapids, Minnesota. We were celebrating our college graduation and we wanted to spend a few days fishing and just sort of hanging out a little bit. The place that we found online was massive too. It was a 2-story log lodge built back in like the 1930s that had been divided into smaller guest suites. Our first afternoon there, I went back to the room alone to grab a jacket. When I unlocked the door, I was surprised to find the heavy brass floor lamp and the ceiling fan both spinning on high, even though I knew for a fact that we'd turned them off before heading down to the lake. I sat on the couch for a bit, watching the bulb in the lamp flicker, and I assumed that the place just had sketchy, outdated wiring. I clicked the lamp off and went into the bathroom to wash my hands, and when I walked back into the main room, the lamp was glowing bright again. A few hours later, my cousin came back too. We were sitting at the kitchen table talking when we both heard a woman's voice with a thick, distinct accent clearly call out our childhood nicknames from the hallway. We stopped talking and stared at each other. My cousin muttered, "Did you hear that?" I said, "Yeah, sounds like somebody's right outside that door." I jumped up, yanked the heavy wood door open, and looked down the hallway. It was completely empty, and the screen door at the end of the hall was latched tight. We figured that it must have been a guest in the next suite over, but it really didn't sit right with me. The next day, though, after lunch, we decided to take a quick nap before heading back out to the water, and my cousin was lying on his bed across the room when he suddenly started laughing. I asked him what was so funny, and he told me to stop screwing around and touching his foot. I, though, was lying completely on the other side of the room, under my blanket, and at no point had I touched him. I told him to cut it out and to stop trying to freak me out so that he could sleep, and he sat up, totally serious, and said that something had just grabbed his ankle. I brushed it off, telling him that he must have just been dreaming or imagining things and rolled back over. Not even 10 minutes later, though, I was lying on my back looking at my phone when a heavy suffocating pressure dropped right next to me on the mattress. It felt exactly like a large, solid person had just climbed into the bed beside me, and before I could even react, I felt a distinct physical squeezing grip tighten around my ribs and legs, pinning me to the sheets. I tried to yell out to my cousin, but my throat felt completely tight all of a sudden. I was wide awake, staring directly at the log rafters. I forced myself to take a deep breath, and I said out loud into the empty room, "Hey, get off, leave us alone. We aren't causing any trouble, so cut it out." After about 5 long minutes of that heavy weight pressing into my chest, the air suddenly cleared and the pressure just vanished. The weirdest part of the trip, though, happened on our final night there. We had gone out to a local tavern down the road and got back to the lodge at around midnight, I think. I walked into the main lobby area, heading toward the vending machines, when a man in a heavy dark wool 3-piece suit stepped out of the shadow of the stairwell and blocked my path. He had these massive, old-fashioned mutton chop sideburns, like something straight out of an old 19th century portrait. He stepped right in front of me, looked me up and down, and demanded to know what room I was staying in and why I was walking around the building like this. I told him that I was a paying guest and just wanted a soda, but he kept getting more hostile, stepping closer and telling me that I didn't belong there. I saw the night clerk sitting behind the front desk just 30 feet away, so I yelled out, "Hey, tell this guy I'm in room 4. The clerk didn't even lift his head, though. He just kept staring down at his logbook. At that point, I got completely fed up with this, So I told the guy in the suit that the lobby was a public space and I wasn't showing him anything, and if he had a problem that he could take it up with the staff. My cousin walked in right then and asked the guy if he even worked there. The man just stared at us with this completely flat, angry expression and claimed that he was the manager. I was in a terrible mood that afternoon, so we just turned around and walked back to our suite. Now, the next morning at 6 a.m., we went down to the lobby to check out and grab some coffee. I walked straight up to the same night clerk who had been sitting there the night before, and I asked him, "Why didn't you say anything to that manager guy with the sideburns last night? He was harassing us right in front of your desk." The clerk looked up at me, completely blanked face, and said, "What are you talking about?" I then said, "The guy in the black wool suit from last night, the one standing by the stairs." The clerk shook his head and said, "We don't have anyone on staff who looks like that. I've been sitting at the desk alone since like 10 o'clock yesterday layout, and I didn't see anyone." I looked past his shoulder at the lobby wall. It was lined with old framed black and white photographs of the original logging crew that built the lodge in the 30s. And right in the center of the main photo was a man dressed in the exact same dark wool suit, staring straight at the camera with those identical heavy sideburns. Well, we packed our bags into the truck and we left the key on the counter without saying another word because, well, I really don't know what to think about that. So I was living in a small college town in southeastern Ohio, sharing a pretty cramped off-season lake cabin with a couple of roommates. To make a little bit of extra cash, I signed up for an evening community pottery class that met once a week at the old county fairground exhibition hall. The building was an enormous sprawling brick structure built back in the late 1940s, full of winding concrete corridors, empty livestock stalls used for storage, and heavy metal doors too. There had been some rumors around the county for years that the back wing of the hall, where the old boiler room sat, had something completely wrong with it. People talked about an odd or aggressive heavy presence that had driven out several caretakers over the decades, or something like that. During our third week of class, though, a girl left the kiln room to go use the vending machines down the hall, and less than 2 minutes later, she came sprinting back into the room, completely hysterical. She was screaming so hard that her breath was catching in her throat, sobbing about a massive shadow-like figure that had been crouched flat against the ceiling at the end of the corridor, staring right down at her. Looking at the raw terror in her face, nobody in the room thought that she was making it up. She dropped the class that night, and one of her friends told us later that she wouldn't even drive past the fairgrounds anymore. Anyway, about a month after that, I had my own encounter, which was terrifying. So I left the pottery studio to find a restroom. The back wing of the building was a complete maze of identical concrete hallways, and because the county was trying to save on electricity, half the overhead fluorescent tubes were turned off, and that left long stretches of the corridor completely dark. I turned a corner and realized that I was now suddenly completely turned around. As I was standing there trying to figure out which way led back to the kilns, a massive guttural roar literally ripped through the hallway from right behind my left shoulder. It didn't sound like an animal, mind you, and it didn't sound exactly human either. It was this heavy, vibrating boom that actually rattled the metal breaker boxes on the concrete wall. My instincts completely took over, though. I didn't look back. I just lunged forward, yanked open the nearest heavy door, and threw myself into a brightly lit room. It turned out to be an old utility office where one of the fairground's elderly administrative secretaries was sorting through paperwork. I expected her to yell at me for bursting in like that, but she just sort of looked up from her desk, saw how badly my hands were shaking, and went completely pale. She looked at me and said in a quiet voice, "You heard it, didn't you?" I nodded, my chest heaving, totally unable to speak. She didn't ask any questions. She closed her ledger, stood up, and told me that she was walking me back to the studio. As we walked down the dark concrete halls, she kept one hand clamped tightly over a small silver crucifix on her collarbone, her eyes darting frantically toward the exposed rafters above our heads. I never went back to the fairgrounds after that semester, but the stories about that back wing kept coming. The next year, a local guy told me that he had apparently been cutting through the fairgrounds late one night after his truck broke down on the county road, and as he walked past the high brick wall of the exhibition hall, he looked up and saw the distinct silhouette of a massive broad-shouldered figure pressed against one of the small windows, nearly 30 feet off the ground, where there weren't any walkways or stairs or anything. There was another incident where a couple of teenagers from the next town over snuck into the old livestock storage bays on a dare, and one of them ran out into the middle of the crowded midway 10 minutes later, completely sobbing and hyperventilating, with the front of his jeans soaked through. He was a pretty big, tough kid who played football for the regional high school, but he was completely reduced to a shaking mess, screaming that something had reached out from the darkness of the stalls and actually grabbed him. I still don't know what to make of that building. I like to think of myself as someone who needs hard proof before I believe in anything strange, but when I remember the physical weight of that roar hitting the back of my neck in the concrete maze of that place, it makes me realize just how little we actually know about what's left behind in the dark. When I was about 9 years old, my mum used to sign me up for the late evening indoor swimming leagues at the community recreation center not far from where we lived. The building was an old, flat-roofed concrete municipal complex from the late 1970s, I think. It always smelled like heavy chlorine, damp towels, and wet tiles. The pool area was shaped like a massive T, and the top of the T was the deep diving well, the long stem of the T that ran down into the shallow lanes. Off to the side of the main pool deck, behind a set of glass brick windows, was the old toddler splash pool. Because it was January, that side of the room was drained, dark, and completely closed off for the season. One Friday night, around 8:30, my swim heat ended early. My mum was out in the lobby talking to one of the coaches, and my younger brother was already in the locker room. I was sitting on a plastic bench by the equipment bins, shivering in my damp towel, waiting for my mum to come and grab me. The main overhead floodlights had just been clicked off by the lifeguards, leaving only the blue underwater pool lights glowing through the water. I looked up from the bleachers, looking across the damp concrete toward the glass brick wall of the closed toddler room, and sitting right on the edge of the empty tiled splash basin was a young girl. She looked to be about 10, maybe 11 years old, completely out of place, wearing a dark, heavy vintage woolen winter coat with a stiff white collar, long grey socks, and black button-up shoes. Her skin, though, was incredibly white, almost giving off a faint matte glare that illuminated the blue tiles directly around her feet, but left the rest of the dark room completely black. Her hair was solid, unnatural, silver white, cut into a perfect straight heavy bowl cut that stopped right above her eyes. Her mouth, it was hanging open just a tiny fraction, like she was completely congested. But her eyes were the part that made me really freak out. They were huge, way wider than any normal kid's eyes. They weren't human. They were a bright yellow, glassy sort of green, with thick vertical black slits for pupils, exactly like a cat's eyes. She wasn't blinking, she was just staring straight through the glass bricks directly at my bench. My 9-year-old brain just completely freaked out. In that weird, stubborn way that kids handle being terrified, I also decided that if I just walked over to the drinking fountain by the locker room doors, which meant walking directly past that glass wall, everything would go back to being normal. So I stood up on the cold concrete and took a step forward. The second that my bare feet hit the wet tile, this bizarre sound started echoing off the walls. It sounded like the distinct sound of sneakers squeaking on the tiles, but It was coming from everywhere. As I edged along the wall toward the fountain, I looked deeper through the glass bricks, and behind the cat-eyed girl, other shapes were moving in the dark, and they were in the empty basin. There were two young boys, completely blue and semi-transparent, tossing a heavy rubber playground ball back and forth. To their right, a third blue see-through girl was sort of skipping rope on the dry tile, and that's when I noticed that from the knees down, their legs just dissolved into grey mist. The girl on the basin edge didn't turn her head, but those vertical black pupils tracked me perfectly through the glass as I shuffled by. The noise was now ringing in my ears so loud that it made my head hurt too. I finally reached the stainless steel fountain and hit the button. The sharp, loud hiss of the waterline pressure instantly cut the noise. The entire facility went dead silent. I took a fast gulp, trying to convince myself that I was just seeing things because I was so exhausted from the swimming laps. I let go of the button, and the moment that the water stopped running, that same heavy sound came back again, screaming into my ear, louder than before. I snuck a look over my shoulder. The silver-haired girl was still sitting on the tile edge, those eyes burning right into my face while the transparent blue kids kept throwing the ball behind her. I didn't turn my back again. I literally walked backward all the way to the locker room doors, keeping my eyes locked on those vertical slits until I burst through the heavy plastic curtains into the bright, normal lights of the changing area. After that, though, I refused to go back to that recreational center and started attending somewhere else with my mum. In the end, too, they ended up tearing the old pool wing down a few years later. But to this day, whenever I hear the squeaking sound of sneakers, my skin just absolutely crawls. A few years ago, my girlfriend and I were packed up and getting ready to move into our first apartment together. The house that I was leaving was a completely normal, two-story colonial, split-level, built in the early 2000s. It wasn't some ancient historic property or anything, just a standard drywall and siding suburban home, really. On our very last weekend there, a buddy of mine came over to help us tape up some final boxes, and afterward, the three of us sat on the living room floor eating some takeout. Around 11:30, my friend stood up to head home, and he was completely practical, a stubborn guy who laughed at anything remotely strange or superstitious. I walked behind him to the front door, watched him walk down the driveway, and locked the door behind him. I walked back into the living room and asked my girlfriend if she was ready to call it a night. We killed the lamps and walked out into the entryway to head up to the carpet stairs. Right as she started telling me what time that we needed to wake up the next morning, a weird vibration sort of echoed from the top landing. I grabbed her arm and told her to freeze. We stood dead still in the hallway, listening. A second later, it happened again. 3 distinct heavy hand claps snapped through the drywall from the empty master bedroom upstairs. My girlfriend's first instinct was that my buddy had somehow snuck back inside through a window, or that he had never left really, and that we were playing a joke on her. But before she could even call his name, the exact same 3 claps boomed out from the dark ceiling right above our heads. Our stomachs completely flipped. We didn't even grab our shoes. We just yanked the front door open, sprinted out into the driveway, and slammed the door behind us. Standing under the streetlight, my girlfriend was still hyperventilating and insisting that my friend must be hiding in the attic somewhere. He only lived about a 5-minute walk down the block, and he'd only been gone for maybe 90 seconds, I would say. I pulled out my phone with a violently shaking hand and I called him, begging him to turn around and come back. Because he was such a skeptic, he thought that I was totally full of it and complained that he was too tired to play games. But I was practically screaming into the receiver, so he finally grumbled and agreed to walk back. While we were waiting on the street, the silence of the neighborhood started making us sort of second guess ourselves a bit too. We began wondering if it was just the water heater popping or the house settling or something. To prove it to herself, my girlfriend stepped onto the porch, cracked the front door open an inch, and shouted up into the dark stairwell, "If there's someone up there, do it again." Without a single millisecond of delay, the house answered. 3 sharp, deafening claps, rattling the front glass. She literally slammed the door and backed into the yard just as my buddy rounded the corner. He walked up looking completely annoyed, convinced that we were just trying to freak him out. He had absolutely zero fear, mind you, so he pushed past us, unlocked the door, and stepped right into the front entryway while we stayed out on the concrete porch. He stood right at the bottom of the carpeted steps, looking up into the pitch black of the second floor. My girlfriend, her voice cracking, called out through the screen door, "Do it one more time." And from the top of the stairs, it happened. It wasn't as loud this time, but it was completely clear. 3 dry, deliberate claps coming from the empty hallway floorboards. My buddy slowly turned his head around to look at me through the screen door. Every bit of color had completely drained from his face, and his mouth was open. I had known him since we were kids, and I had never seen his eyes look that blank and terrified before. He didn't say a word. He just walked straight out of the house, locked the door behind him, and handed me the keys with a hand that wouldn't stop trembling. We slept in my truck at a 24-hour truck stop parking lot that night, and we hired a moving crew to grab the rest of our boxes the next afternoon. Years later, too, my mother actually finally let slip after a few drinks at Thanksgiving that apparently she used to hear those exact same 3 claps coming from the drywall when she was home alone during the day, but she was too embarrassed to tell anyone. Honestly, too, I'm actually pretty glad that we had multiple witnesses for this, because if I had been alone in that hallway, I probably genuinely would have thought that I was completely losing my mind. Back in 2023, I was completely overwhelmed. My marriage had abruptly ended in a messy, exhausting divorce, and right as I was trying to find a new place to live, my older sister fell severely ill with a chronic respiratory condition. She lived alone in a small, damp rental townhouse in New Jersey, so I packed 2 suitcases and moved into her living room couch to help manage her medications and take care of her full time. Almost the exact day that I unpacked as well, the layout of that townhouse started feeling just suffocating. My sister, who was confined to her upstairs bedroom most of the day, kept complaining about a weird scratching sound inside of her walls. She said that she could hear a low, flat voice muttering her name from the vents as well, and I tried to stay rational, telling her that she was just having vivid dreams from the heavy steroids that her doctor prescribed, but I was secretly a little bit scared of breaking down myself, I guess. Then, less than a week later, it was my turn. But the worst part was that it actually happened at 1 p.m. on a bright, sunny Tuesday. I had finished running a load of laundry down in the basement and walked up to the second floor to check if my sister needed any water. The sun was streaming directly in through her bedroom window, hitting the carpet, and the moment that I crossed the threshold, my jaw sort of locked tightly, because standing right at the foot of her mattress was a woman dressed in an oversized black winter coat. I could see her face perfectly in the daylight. Her skin was a dull, waxy gray, and her eyes were absolutely huge, wide open and bulging forward so far that it looked like the lids couldn't possibly close over them. She was staring directly at my throat too, which was weird. I completely froze, losing the ability to draw air or even make a sound for a moment. Out of pure frantic survival instinct, I think, I slammed both hands over my eyes and started repeating a random childhood prayer out loud, my voice shaking uncontrollably. I stood there blind for a full 60 seconds. when I finally dropped my hands, the space by the mattress was empty. My sister was still resting quietly. 2 nights later, though, the physical escalation started. I was on the living room pull-out sofa downstairs. The house was dead quiet, and as I was drifting into a deep sleep, I noticed a thick, solid mass or something of shadow standing near the television at the foot of the bed, and it wasn't moving. Out of nowhere, though, a violent force literally yanked my ankles. Something completely invisible grabbed my skin and dragged me toward the bottom of the sofa with massive force. The weight of the pull was so sudden and heavy that my thick wool comforter was launched completely off the frame, landing across the room against the baseboards. I bolted upright in the dark, my adrenaline spiking so hard that I felt physically sick, and scrambled up the stairs to spend the rest of the night sitting on the floor of my sister's room. The absolute breaking point, though, happened yesterday afternoon. So my mum was driving over to drop off some groceries, and about 10 minutes after she arrived, I was sitting alone at the small laminate kitchen table eating a sandwich, when suddenly a sharp white-hot pain flared up in both of my forearms. It felt exactly like 2 massive, heavy hands had clamped around my wrists, squeezing the bone with immense pressure. I could actually feel the distinct hard shape of individual fingers boring into my tendons. And the second that I heard my mum's tires crunch on the gravel driveway outside, I threw that kitchen door open and ran into the yard, sobbing completely hysterically. I told her that I couldn't step back inside that frame, that I needed to pack my things and leave the state immediately. She grabbed my shoulders, trying to get me to breathe, and asked what had happened. When I told her about the pressure in the kitchen, she reached out and pulled back the sleeves of my sweater. Both of our faces went totally pale. Deep, dark purple bruises were already rising on the skin around both of my wrists. You could perfectly track the symmetry of 2 large hands pressed deep into the flesh and my skin. "It's my ex," I choked out, completely losing my mind on the lawn. "He's doing something. He told me that I'd never get away from him. He's using something to track me down." But my mum gripped my face tightly, looking right at me. "No," she said, her voice dropping. "Your ex-husband is 3 states away. This isn't a person. This is something else. Something entirely malicious, it seems." She called her brother that afternoon, who brought over a local pastor that he knew from a traditional parish down the highway. The man walked through every room of that townhouse, reciting prayers and wiping down the door frames. And, wouldn't you know it, it actually worked. Since that afternoon, the heavy pressure in the hallways has completely lifted, and the scratching in the drywall, it stopped. But there is one detail that still makes my stomach turn a little bit. You see, a few weeks ago, I was talking to an old mutual friend from my ex-husband's hometown, and she casually mentioned that his family had a long, notorious history in their rural county for practicing weird generational folk curses and occult stuff out of their barn or something. I used to think that those stories were just small-town gossip, but after looking at that finger mark on my own skin, well, these days, I'm not so sure anymore. In 2018, my mom, my twin sisters, and I were on a driving trip through eastern Pennsylvania, checking out a bunch of historical spots and local antique markets. We ended up taking a detour down a long 2-lane county road outside of Bethlehem, passing through an old semi-abandoned industrial limestone quarry site that had been turned into a nature preserve many years ago. The 3 of us always had a weirdly identical sensitivity to certain locations. We'd occasionally pull up to an old building or maybe a trail and all feel the exact same sort of unexplainable feeling. So we generally knew when a spot had a bit of a bad history. This site was completely empty when we pulled our car into the gravel turnout. At the edge of the walking path stood a small rusted steel memorial marker dedicated to a young local worker who had been killed in a machinery collapse back in the early 90s. It had a small faded color photograph of the guy attached to the metal behind a cracked piece of plexiglass. I was the first one to walk up to this marker, and the second that my eyes focused on the face in the photo, a sudden white-hot agony flared up in my right shoulder. It was so intense and physical that my breath caught completely in my throat, and I collapsed sideways onto the gravel path, clutching my arm. For context, I had turned my rotator cuff in a bad fall a few years prior, and that joint had always been a bit of a weak point for me. My sharp yell immediately brought my mum running over from the car though, and the moment that she stepped within 10 feet of the metal marker, she stopped dead in her tracks, clamped her hands over her temples, and groaned. She was hit with a sudden violent migraine so severe that her eyes started tearing up. She staggered backward toward a wooden bench, and I managed to sort of limp over to join her, keeping my weight off of my right side. I looked back at my sisters, who were still walking up the gravel trail, and screamed at them to stay away from the clearing. But the younger of the twins didn't listen. She stepped up to the edge of the quarry fencing to see what we were looking at, and within 3 seconds, she doubled over, clutching her stomach. A wave of dry, heaving nausea hit her so quickly that she couldn't even speak. She had severe gastrointestinal issues since she was like a toddler, and she said that it felt like her stomach completely knotted itself into a ball. My mother as well had cluster headaches as a bit of a problem as well, so it seemed like it was a total coordinated physical assault on every single one of our pre-existing bodily weaknesses, happening in the exact same geographic radius and in the exact moment. We didn't say another word though. I helped my mum back to the passenger seat. My sister crawled into the back still clutching her stomach, and we peeled out of the gravel lot as fast as the car would go. By the time that we hit the state highway about 20 miles away, the physical symptoms had vanished from all three of us just as quickly as they had arrived. I actually drove back through the same county road alone about a year ago in 2025. I parked my car, walked right up to the rusted steel marker, and stood there for about 10 minutes. The air felt totally light and the sun was warm, and I didn't feel a single thing. Whatever heavy, hostile energy had been anchored to that gravel clearing had completely broken loose and, well, seemed to have moved on. Between the ages of 12 and 14, my family was living in a crowded multi-family apartment block in a dense suburb outside of Chicago. My bedroom was a narrow, low-ceilinged room at the very back of the flat, right up against the service stairwell. It was a pretty stressful, volatile period in our house too, and looking back, the environment in that room felt really hostile from the day that we moved in. It started with small, sort of jarring details. Like, one night I looked up at the wall space above my tall laminate chest of drawers and saw a dense, ink-black shadow, and it was shaped like a tightly curled infant, is the only way that I can put it. I know, weird, but that's just what it looked like. It stayed completely frozen there for hours, too. Years later, my mother casually mentioned that she had miscarried a late-term pregnancy right before I was born, and she admitted that during our first year in that apartment, she used to constantly wake up at 2 a.m, convinced that she heard a baby wailing from the hallway vents, though my siblings and I were always dead to the world. By that winter, though, the bedroom felt a lot like a pressure cooker. I'd be lying awake trying to sleep, and the air around my face would completely shift. I'd feel a distinct warm pocket of air blow directly into my ear as well. And one night, a voice completely disconnected from the room loudly whispered my first name right next to my pillow. If I walked out to the kitchen to grab water and left my bedroom door popped wide open, I would turn around to find the heavy wooden door completely clicked shut into the latch. I got so terrified that I started sleeping with a desk lamp burning at all times and a small desktop television playing static on a loop. But then, the television began turning its own volume dial up and down in increments, while the remote sat across the room on a desk. But the most frequent and, unnerving thing was the physical shaking of my mattress. I would be lying completely still, holding my breath, and the entire spring frame would begin vibrating and shuddering under my weight, like a heavy engine was running directly underneath the floorboards. Eventually, the activity bled into the daylight hours too. I'd be sitting at my desk doing homework or something like that, and a loose laptop charging cord lying flat on the rug would suddenly flip 3 inches into the air on its own. My dad, a friend from school, and I all stood in the kitchen one afternoon and listened to a massive heavy stomping sound rattle the ceiling panels from the crawl space above, an area with no floorboards and barely 2 feet of clearance. Through the window, I'd occasionally see the blurry hooded outlines of figures walking along the narrow exterior fire escape's walkway, even though that level was completely blocked off from the street. My older sister, she shared the room with me for a year as well. She was a total pragmatist and never claimed to see the heavy shadows or anything, but she did admit that the air in the corners made her skin crawl a little bit, and she watched the heavy window curtains sway and snap back and forth when every single glass pane was locked tight against the winter wind one day. Anyway, when I turned 15, I moved into the smaller box room down the hall, but the physical sensations only got heavier. I started experiencing severe, terrifying bouts of waking paralysis. I would wake up from chaotic nightmares, completely locked into my own body, unable to even lift my chin, watching the room grow unnaturally dark. And every single night, without fail, that heavy vibration in the mattress would start up again, a shuddering that absolutely terrified me now. Now I'm in my late 20s. I live in a regular modern apartment complex in the city, but the mattress vibration has recently started up again over the last few weeks. I've been going through an incredibly stressful, emotional, draining situation with someone in my personal life, and I'm barely getting 3 hours of broken sleep a night. When I was a teenager, I actually went to a clinic to see a neurologist about the shaking, convinced that I had some kind of inner ear disorder or a neurological glitch or whatever. They ran a battery of tests as well, but every scan came back completely clean, and I've never had any history or diagnosis of clinical sleep or mental health disorders or anything. Because the physical shuddering in the mattress always returns during periods of intense emotional stress, it makes me look back at that entire chaotic childhood apartment with a lot of questions. I had a very difficult, unstable upbringing, and my memory of those years is incredibly hazy from the trauma of that household. When I was even younger, I remember being terrified because the faces in my wall posters seemed to distort, or I'd see phantom bugs tracking across the wall that vanished when I hit the light switch. It makes me wonder, though, if a person's nervous system, when subjected to extreme stress or trauma at a young age, can project that internal pressure outward into physical symptoms of some sort, or if certain environments are just inherently broken and some of us are wired to feel whatever that is. This happened when I was 4, so I don't remember all of the minor details, but my mum does, and we kind of trace back this whole thing when I suddenly got reminded of it because of, other stories here. I'll try my best to explain and add the bits from my mum's memory, but bear with me. So we used to live in a very rural area at the time, and we owned a small farm. Most people in that area had their own farmlands, but the houses were located about 5 miles away from the area where all the farms were. It was the time when we had only one cell phone that my father used to keep with him all the time, and no landline at our house. There was a public telephone booth 2 blocks down that a lot of people in the neighborhood used though. Now, it was around summer I think, but there was this group of gypsies and they were notorious for stealing the crops and would also rob people occasionally, especially women working alone at the farms. My father had a regular job besides managing the farm, so he'd leave very early and would be back late at night. Normally, my mum would manage the farms by herself, but since the gypsies were going through around and robbing people, she stopped going there for a while, and I was also very young then. Most people in our neighborhood, they worked at their farms starting early mornings till evenings, so our neighborhood was pretty desolated during the daytime, except a few people like 3 or 4 blocks down to our house. Mum was always very careful about locking the main doors and the windows, so there wasn't too much to worry about. My Gramps, from my mum's side, he was visiting us one of these days, and he's like a very tall, big guy. I was playing in the dining table area, my back facing the main entrance, and my mum was in the kitchen, while Gramps was inside the guest room, since he just arrived, changing or freshening up. The thing though is that my mum forgot to lock the main entrance after Gramps came in and had no idea about it. I was facing my mum telling her about whatever little me was doing, and she was facing the entrance, and I clearly remember feeling terrified by the sudden change of expression on my mum's face. Now that I'm more aware of the wide range of emotions than a 4-year-old, I can tell that it was a mixture of dread, shock, and pure anxiety. She left whatever she was doing in an instant, and now she was standing between me and the entrance shouting with a kitchen knife in her hand, and as I peeked out from behind her, there was a woman and she had a sickle in her hand inside of our house. She was standing there, trying to make conversation as if it was just normal. She definitely thought that we were the only people in the house. She was wearing a lot of metal jewelry and stuff. The gypsies wore those. Mum was telling me to run to Gramps, and I was crying, not wanting to leave her because I could probably sense the danger. It's only been like 2 minutes and my Gramps come running down and yelling from the room in the far back, telling the woman to get the heck out of our house. She was still trying to pretend and telling stuff like she just wanted some water and this is a pretty house, but now she was also backing away. More yelling and shouting from Gramps and Mum, and the woman finally left. My mum locked the entrance, and now my Gramps was trying to calm her down as she was shaking a lot. My mum told me later that the most scary part was that she couldn't even notice the woman getting inside, and I could have been seriously hurt or possibly taken hostage if she had noticed even just a little bit later. And the woman didn't even flinch when it was just my mum shouting at her with a kitchen knife in her hand. So she was not scared at all by her and was most probably looking for an opportunity to take her on. My mum was a small build and that gypsy woman was tall, like much taller than my mum. No wonder she was prepared to take her chances. For some context, I'm a 25-year-old male, and this happened when I was about 13. Yes, it's been a long time since it happened, but my family and I still talk about it to this day, as it involved all of us. And while we still do talk about it, I unfortunately have a hard time remembering the exact dates and some parts of it due to some head trauma. So that means some of the finer details I just cannot remember at this moment. But I know that this happened sometime during the year of 2012. I think it happened on our way from Washington to Oklahoma. We had made this trip several times, but I cannot remember if it was on our way to Washington or from Washington that year. But basically, we had been on the road all day. It was night, the sun had already set, and everyone was tired. But we had 2 cars to fit everything. Me, my sister, and my mum rode in the SUV, while my brother and his girlfriend at the time, now wife, rode in the small 4-door car. We had been on a long stretch of road surrounded by pine trees on both sides. The GPS said that we wouldn't reach another town for a good few miles, but there were lights just down the road, and so we thought maybe the GPS needed to be updated or something, because some small towns tended not to show up on these at the time. I don't remember the name of the brand that we had, but You sort of stuck it to the car window, plugged it into your car, entered the address, and picked your route. We usually took the same routes every time, depending on the time of year. And I don't remember which route that we took, but it could have been during the summer or fall, but I could be wrong about that. In any case, we knew the routes by this point, and we really weren't expecting this town. We came closer, and my brother called my mum, and the conversation went something along the lines of saying that he was getting tired and his girlfriend was already asleep or something, so she couldn't drive. My mum agreed that she may be too tired for once and needed to pull over to find a hotel in this town, and he said all right, and he slowed to get behind us so he could follow us to pull over. At this point, everything seemed, pretty fine, and nothing was really out of the ordinary. It wasn't until we passed the sign with the name of the town on it that my gut twisted. I remember watching as we neared the town, and there was just an inkling of a feeling that I didn't understand yet. Everything seemed fine, but I kept watching my surroundings as we drove. The lights had a sort of sickly yellow or orange hue to them. I remember looking at the sign as we passed it, but I can't remember the name of the town. And the funny thing about that too is that no one can. No one's been able to. Yet we wrote it down that night and the day after, so we didn't come through it again. But anyways, we passed the sign and my gut just suddenly drops. At the time, I didn't understand what I was feeling was anxiety. I just remember thinking that we're being watched. But looking around, there was no one. Well, yes, it was the middle of the night, so people were probably asleep. There were also no cars. The buildings were empty. The air itself was stagnant as we drove through it. Now, I know Kid Me had a very active imagination, but my older brother can confirm the town was empty in a way that it scared even him. We saw a church sitting on a small hill just to the right side of the town, and we drove up to it. We parked near the door as it was the only light in the gravel parking lot. Also, this was the only light that was white and didn't have a sick hue to it. But we all stepped out of the cars to stretch our legs for a bit and find a hotel. My mum told me and my sister, who was about 9 or 10 at the time, to stay close, slipping in the fact that she had this creepy feeling as well. At the time, I dismissed the small statement and just walked around the car to move my legs when something moves behind the big dumpster that's across the parking lot. The light on the door didn't reach all the way out to the dumpster. I could barely see its outline to even know that it even was a dumpster, but something scattered along the gravel as if darting behind it. My mum hears this too and orders me and my sister to get into the car. I stood, staring for a moment before walking backwards to the car. For whatever reason, I didn't feel like turning my back to it. We waited in the car as my brother had his girlfriend get in the car and walked my mum to the SUV and helped her put the address in for the GPS. Once it was set, he got in the car and we drove off. And for some reason, I just couldn't get myself to look back at the dumpster as we drove off. We drive through the town and again, everything seems eerily empty and clean. There was no litter, no trash, nothing that suggested life besides the streetlights that were on. We head to the edge of town, following the GPS, and turn onto this gravel road that led down into a giant opening surrounded by thick, dense woods. In said lot was the motel. And I don't mean the fancy sort of hotel and motels now. No, this was a 2-story L-shaped building with about 30 to 40 rooms and a check-in maybe. There was a separate small building just to the side of the hotel rooms. It only had one light in the lot besides the small ones above the doors, and this light was a hollow white. We pulled in and my mum called my brother and said to stay in the car, that she was going to go and talk to whoever was inside. Now, here's where things get a little tricky. The building was small, but the windows were huge. We could see inside enough to watch our mother go in and talk to the guy at the counter. But here's the thing. Me, my sister, and my brother all saw different things. When our mother went in, I saw her talk to an old man who had a thin, frail stature and a permanent scowl. He seemed old and weary and sort of miserable, I guess. His eyes were slightly sunken in and his skin slightly pale and hanging slightly. My sister says, though, that she saw a young man who seemed nervous and annoyed, dark hair and deep eyes. But my brother says that he saw a middle-aged man who was aloof and uncaring. He had a beard and dark hair. I cannot remember all the details they gave me, but I knew the main differences. When our mother came out, she got into the car and waved for my brother to follow. We parked in front of our rooms. She had gotten 2 rooms side by side. We were told to only bring in the essentials for the night because, well, she doesn't want to stay any longer than necessary in the morning. We all agree and grabbed as little as we needed, and we headed into our rooms. My sister and my mother and I stayed in the right room, while my brother and his girlfriend stayed in the left. My sister had asked to take a shower, and of course our mother went to help get it ready, as my sister wasn't sure how this one worked. Well, turns out it didn't. The water just wouldn't turn on. So she calls my brother and explains, and of course he comes to get her so she can shower in theirs, and while they go and do that, my mum looks at the beds, realizing that I'm staring at them, and she goes, "You don't want to touch them either, do you?" Hearing I wasn't alone in this feeling, I smiled and I shook my head. I said that it feels gross, and she said that it does. She went to check the beds when my brother came running back to our room. He opened the door frantically, and of course it startled us a bit. He said to pack my things and asked my mum to come here. She nodded and followed and began putting stuff back in my bag. My sister came back over and she looked freaked out. I remember offering to help her pack and asking what had happened, and at first she had a bit of a hard time trying to say it, but finally got it out that there was blood in the shower when they went in. She freaked out and had Caleb check it out, and he came to get our mum. She came back and calmly said to put our things back into the truck and to get in. At that point, it really hit how bad this place felt. I began to panic, and I hurried to put our stuff in the car, and we got in, and my brother nor my mum wasted any time driving away, not even stopping to get a refund for not staying or telling them about the blood. We turned to continue going through the town onto the one that we knew about, and unfortunately, my brother needed gas. Luckily, as we get to the edge of town, like the rest of it is in our rearview mirrors, there was a gas station, but again, no cars, not even an employee's car. My brother pulls up to the pump and my mum pulls up to the one next to it, so we're all still together. We all jump out and go inside after my brother pumps his gas. At this point, we're all sort of awake, so we grab a drink and a snack and we pay for the gas. That all goes fine until we go back outside. We're all heading back to the cars, and my brother's girlfriend was in the car already. I was walking next to him, and I don't remember what we were talking about, but we were laughing some to kind of ease the tension, I guess. But, well, I'm standing next to him, and he's putting the thing back to the pump, and something moves across the parking lot. Both of our heads sort of shoot up, and we're staring at a shed in the back corner, along with tall, intimidating trees behind it, when all of a sudden, 2 figures dart and run behind the shed. My brother slowly closes his gas tank without taking his eyes off of the shed, and he tells me to get back into the car. As soon as he says it, 3 pairs of glowing yellow amber eyes are staring back at us from beside the shed, yet taller than it. My brother yells for us to get in the car and that we need to leave. He books it to the front seat of his car as I jump into the truck, and he speeds off, my mum following after him. My mum is asking what happened because she didn't see that part, but luckily my sister had seen it also. We began telling her what had happened, and she called my brother. He told her the same thing, and she said that we'll never be coming through there ever again. After this, we drove to the next town and found a Holiday Inn, and we went there instead. We spent the next hour, I think, just kind of talking about what had happened, until we were all calm enough to finally get some sleep. Now, the next day I remember us trying to look up the town that we had gone through the night before, but we just couldn't find anything. We thought that maybe it just wasn't a well-known town, so we got our older maps, and Even asked the people that worked there about the town a few miles away, and nobody knew anything about it. They even said that there wasn't a town there that way for miles. Since then, it's had us all dumbfounded about it. Now, there's no point trying to find it anymore, as we just cannot remember the name of it, like I said earlier. But it's still a deep enough rooted memory that we all talk about it still. It's not often, but it's like something we cannot forget, no matter how hard we try. I'm telling this story secondhand on behalf of the person who experienced it. I was told this story in 2012, and it has stuck with me ever since. Now that I've recently found this place, I wanted to share this encounter with all of you. So the gentleman who imparted this story to me did so after a lengthy evening of enjoying beers at the fire pit in the backyard of his, at the time, Reading CA home. He recounted the time when he was a teenager, living in a nearby town called Red Bluff. He had a girlfriend who lived within walking distance of his home, and he used to sneak out and head to her house in the middle of the night. He recalled how the road that he would walk to her place, it spanned a rural distance before reaching her neighborhood. On one occasion, he was making his way back home early in the morning after visiting his girlfriend. It was still very much nighttime as he was walking along the road. At this particular section, the road passed through the long, dark section of rural span, only to be momentarily lit by the infrequent passing of car headlights. It was dark and quiet as he walked when he noticed the sound of what must have been footsteps following behind him. He was immediately made uncomfortable by this. It was not uncommon for drugged derelicts and transients to be wandering at this time of night in this area. These would be characters that you would certainly not want anything to do with at this time of night, at this location especially. So he increased his pace, yet the footsteps seemed to remain just as assuredly behind him as before. His discomfort began to elevate to panic when suddenly a car was heading toward him on the desolate road. He knew as the headlights passed that he would have a chance to see who was following him. The moment came and he turned to see what this crackhead wandering in the night might look like, but what he saw was nothing of the sort. He explained to me what he could only describe as what looked like a large Great Dane walking upright on its hind legs. I believe that he did say that it looked like the creature had a snout, but he said the skin looked grey, pale and hairless, and it was very skinny, to the point where you could see its skeleton underneath. The most memorable detail that he kept recalling, though, was the way in which its ribcage protruded, just like that of a Great Dane, he said. The rest of the story is pretty short, but what he saw terrified him, and he started sprinting and didn't stop until he reached the nearest lit area that he could find, which was a random parking lot. He stood there terrified until the sun started coming up, walked the rest of the way home, and he never went down that road at night ever again. This happened a long time ago when I was around 13 to 14 in northwestern GA on the corner of Alabama and TN. Context too is that I'm now 22. So I was at my stepdad's house, which is situated down a long driveway in the woods. There's a house just ahead of this, separated by a thin veil of trees, but no other houses or buildings for a good few miles on either side. And the woods in the back go on for a good while as well, so it's very isolated. I had taken my dog Jack out to pee. Rip Jack, he died a while back. And as I walk down the stairs of the deck with him, he stops and starts to growl, whimper, and it was all sort of directed towards the woodline. Along the right side of the house, I thought maybe there was a coyote or something, so I walked towards the woodline to get a better view, to see what it is that he was freaked out by. And I see something just barely in sight. It stood a good 6 to 7 feet tall, and had patches of fur like mange, a short snout, very canine looking, but kind of human-like face as well, staring at me. Upon seeing that, I backed up, grabbed Jack, and ran up the stairs and locked the front door behind me. I never saw it again after that. It didn't make any moves other than when it was looking at me, but it spooked me so bad that I refused to go outside or even anywhere within the house by myself, to the point where I was just too scared to even leave my room to use the bathroom for quite some time. Yes, I had a few incidences, and I know, gross and embarrassing, but I was a kid and I was freaked the heck out. Now that I'm older, I've started to wonder, maybe if I just imagined it, or maybe if I just misidentified whatever it was. Who really knows, I guess, but what I will never forget is the feeling of fear that I had that day. I was around 6 when it happened. My parents had tucked me in for bed. I live in a rural countryside, so nighttime is very quiet here, no sounds of cars or anything. It's usually very peaceful, and I was laying on my back when suddenly I heard the sound of long nails scratching the wood under my bed. The reason this incident sticks out to me is because I can still remember the feeling of my heart dropping out of my stomach and feeling paralyzed with fear. I was about to call out for my parents when my dad crawled out from under my bed and stood up in the dark, just looking at me. He said, "You forgot to say your prayers," then walked out of my room. I was understandably shocked. I didn't leave my bed afterwards, and I must have fallen asleep at some point. My dad would normally tell me to say my prayers before bed, so this seemed like something that he would say, but I have no idea what would possess him to hide under my bed. My dad denies ever doing this, but I brought it up numerous times over the years, and he has never admitted to doing it. I never really considered until recently, though, that he definitely doesn't have nails long enough to make the deep scratching sound that I heard. But what do you guys think? Maybe I fell asleep and had a vivid dream? I also considered that it could be something paranormal, but I don't know. To answer a few basic questions, though, no, I can't remember if I asked my parents about the incident the next morning, but since then I have asked repeatedly over the last 20-ish years, and my dad has never owned up to it. I believe at this point, though, that my dad couldn't have done it because, well, one, my dad likes scary stuff and would absolutely take credit for a prank that scared me so bad like that. Two, my parents had been gone from my room for probably about 10 minutes before I even heard the scratching. It's possible my dad could have stayed behind, but he could not easily fit under my bed without me noticing, that's for sure. Three, he's not really a drinker, so I doubt that he was passed out on the floor or anything. I'd like to believe that it was just sleep paralysis, like many have theorized. However, that would be my one and only time experiencing it, so that's a bit odd, right? There's definitely a chance that it could have been something more sinister, and it's something that I hope to never, ever encounter again. I once held a hunting lease in Middle Georgia. It was an abandoned hunting camp that hadn't been used in several years. I'm not superstitious at all, but this place was legitimately spooky. It was miles down an overgrown dirt road and completely surrounded by woods. It's probably the most secluded place that I've ever been. I used to hunt there by myself a lot, and there was always this weird sense that I wasn't alone out there. There was a locked gate at the front of the property, but it was not uncommon for us to find the front door of the cabin open, even when the door was locked. That was pretty creepy, but that's not what this story is about. One evening, I was hunting down in a small valley by a food plot that we put lining a creek that bordered the property at. From the minute that I sat down, I had a weird feeling, like I wasn't in a safe place even though I was holding a gun with ballistic-tipped rounds. I just didn't feel like I was the top predator out there, if you know what I mean. I didn't see any deer while I was sitting at the stand, but the forest was abuzz with activity that day. Birds, squirrels, and other critters singing their normal evening symphony. And then, all of a sudden, just silence. Everything just stopped. It felt like everything in the woods was just looking right at me too. It was getting dark fast anyways, and I was obviously extremely creeped out by that, so I packed up my gear and started the walk back up to the cabin. About 100 yards away, I had this feeling that something was coming up behind me. I spun around and pointed my rifle back down the pathway towards the food plot, and that was when I saw it. There was something standing in the middle of the path. It wasn't a person, but it didn't look like a deer or anything that I've seen before. There was hardly any light to make out any features, but it almost looked like some kind of bipedal deer or something. It was just standing there, staring at me too. I quickly made my way back up to the cabin, packed my stuff up, and I just got out of there. I just let the lease run out, and after that, I never went back there. Last year, I started law school in Los Angeles. I have never lived in a big city before, and I was really excited to be in a massive city with over 4 million people. Ever since I was little, I always knew that I had a half-sister in LA, but my parents had this weird anger toward her that always made me feel like a taboo topic, I guess. Of course, I had looked her up on social media and I knew what she looked like, but that was about all. We had never actually met, and she was never that active on social media, so there wasn't a lot that I could see anyway. But out of nowhere one day in my first year of law school, I got a friend request on Facebook from my sister. Her profile seemed legitimate, and she had Facebook friends, and her profile picture looked like her. She sent me a message inviting me to a little dinner party at the park with her friends. We could finally meet each other for the first time. I was new to LA as well, still sort of am, and had no idea which parts of the city to avoid at night. I was really excited about that idea though, but I also had a lot of anxiety about it too. It would be nice if we had met, totally clicked, and became besties for life. But what if we ended up sobbing like we were in some dramatic movie scene? What if I tried to talk with her and she just didn't click with me, and she started showing me an attitude? Or worse, what if it's all going well until we have some kind of disagreement? Someone said something hurtful, and then we were both crying in front of everyone. Honestly, if she had suggested a cozy little bakery for desserts instead, I probably would have gone. But going to a park with other people just didn't feel right. I thought that it was like such a precious moment that I didn't want to have it in front of all these other people. I couldn't bring myself to go, in fact. I didn't want to have to risk having a meltdown in front of all these other people. I was worried about how messy it would get. Anyway, a few weeks later, I googled that park just to see what it was like. Maybe we could meet up there together, just one-on-one after all. And that's when I learned that something was wrong. I won't say the name of the park, but anyone who has lived in LA for long enough will tell you that it's not a safe place for girls to be having a dinner party at night. The area surrounding that park has very high violent crime rates. It's controlled by gangs. Even people who do illegal business in that park are forced to pay a tax to the gang in exchange for being left alone. So now, I was really concerned, but also curious. I actually tried to get a hold of my sister myself. She was an undergrad at the time at a local college. I had a friend who went to her school. I asked my friend to reach out to her on campus and ask her if she'd be okay with meeting us. They connected and the three of us met at my friend's house. And thankfully it was great. We got along really well. My friend was also very happy to do that for us. The three of us had a lot of fun. We weren't bursting in tears, but we let out a few, and we had dinner, we watched a movie, and we spent the night at my friend's house. When I told my sister about that whole thing, she said that she hadn't used Facebook since like high school. So clearly somebody was impersonating her. I would have told her to have reported the fake account, but unfortunately, it had already been deleted. She knew that she had been impersonated on social media though. Another one of her friends had been scammed by someone pretending to be her, and it was some scheme involving fake concert tickets or something like that. Someone, though, had been impersonating my sister. They knew that I was in town, and they literally tried to lure me into one of the most dangerous parts of LA at night. I still have no idea what their actual motives were, but I don't know if I even want to find out, to be honest. I mean, that's a very, very scary thought. Meeting my sister after all these years was a beautiful thing, but the whole backdrop, it was terrifying. This happened 4 years back. It was the middle of winter and the night was unseasonably warm, without a hint of snow on the ground. I left my apartment at around 8 p.m. to go for my daily walk. I worked night shifts and my schedule was pretty messed up, hence the 8 p.m. walk, figuring that I would cross the bridge into the city nearby. For further context, I'm a pretty tall guy who's fairly athletic, and I was in my late 20s at this moment. I'd rarely had a problem walking at night, and at the time I felt safe to do so. So I put my headphones in and I headed towards the bridge. The first 20 minutes were uneventful. I passed by old houses, a subpar Mexican restaurant, a really good Mexican restaurant, a sketchy gas station, and some newly built upscale apartments. And finally, I was at the river, enjoying the view of the bright lights over the dark flowing water, not yet frozen. I crossed the bridge into the city and hit a crosswalk button at a four-way intersection, and then noticed someone standing on the corner opposite. The only other soul I'd seen outside of that night. Seemingly, she was doing nothing, and I assumed that she was waiting for an Uber to come and pick her up, since she didn't seem to be waiting for the light to change. The street, ordinarily busy during the daytime, was now silent. The light changed and I crossed, heading in her direction. As I neared her, I noticed that she would cast glances in my direction and then sort of look away, almost sheepishly. She did this multiple times, and I figured that she was just unnerved by me. I sympathized with that, figuring that it must have made her uneasy, us being the only two people on a dimly lit street like this. As I passed by, I took in her outfit, mostly because I thought that she looked cold. She wore a knitted hat with tassels, a sweater that looked too thin for the winter, tight jeans, and a little plastic children's backpack on her back. I thought that she was in her teens at first, but upon closer inspection, she appeared to be in her late 20s or maybe even early 30s. She had short cropped light brown hair and a pale complexion. She was skinny and was of average height. I was maybe a head taller than her, I would guess. But I walked by and continued down the street without much more of a thought. I passed by high-rise hotels on my right and left and made my way into a central park. During peak hours, this place would be packed with tourists and locals alike, but that day, at an odd hour and with the pandemic in full swing, I felt like the only man in the city. I admired the brilliant display of lighted trees as I crossed through the center of the park, and then, figuring I was at a good halfway point in my journey, I made my way around an old marble and stone library back towards the bridge. As I turned the corner of the library back into the street from which I'd come, I nearly collided with someone moving towards me. It was that same woman that I'd seen not even 10 minutes earlier. My noise-cancelling headphones were still on, so I pulled down one side and said something by way of apology, but she said nothing in return. Instead, she sort of backed away from me and stood below a streetlight, not making eye contact. She stole tiny glances at me, that same tick that I'd noticed before. I put my headphones back on, nodded a good night, and I headed towards the nearest crosswalk. Reason told me that she must have been headed in the direction that I'd come from, since we'd nearly run into each other headed the opposite ways, but some part of me whispered that she wasn't headed that way. And sure enough, when I turned to look, she was trailing close behind me, her strides surprisingly long and energetic. I found this odd enough that I continued to watch her out of the corner of my eye. Shortly after I reached the crosswalk, as I stood there waiting for the light to change, she caught up with me, passed me by, and stopped. A car went past, and as it did so, she squatted over her plastic bag a few meters from me, rifling frantically for something, looking up at me on occasion. I hit a button on my headphones, stopping my podcast so that I could hear her better. What I found disturbing about the motion of her looking through her bag is that it struck me as, well, fake, as though she were pretending for some reason. She was barely looking inside, and her careless motion struck more like bad acting. Something about her motions and the way that she kept looking at me felt wrong. The light changed and I began to walk quickly, but she was faster. She stood suddenly, darting past me towards the museum, swinging the half-open little pink backpack over her shoulder. I watched her silhouette disappear into the darkness beyond the reach of the streetlights. I honestly hoped that that was the end of it, and after a few beats of not seeing her, I let my guard down a little bit, restarting my podcast. Now, beyond the museum was a patch of poorly lit sidewalk, in front of a squat building with mirror-like windows. I wasn't far from the bridge now, and as I made my way back there, I turned my head to look at the reflections of the buildings and the streetlights in the windows. And to my horror, a dark figure sprinted silently towards my reflection, dreamlike. I'm not sure why, but maybe out of sheer confusion, I turned to meet her as she hurtled towards me. Perhaps surprised by my sudden turn, she halted mere feet from me, staring, her eyes wide and looked frantic and wild. She kept looking at my arms, then back at my face, as though almost sizing me up. My accidental bluff had worked, and in the darkness, I suppose I must have looked more prepared to fight back than I felt. But she gripped something small tightly in one hand. Though she held it off to the side and in the shadow of the building, I could see what it was. Seconds dragged as we stood there staring at one another. Immobilized by fear and confusion, I waited for her to make some move, to attempt to use whatever object she held in her hand. And just then, to my enormous relief, a car trundled slowly past us. A bit of my strength returned, and over my blaring podcast, I felt more than heard myself shouting at her, "What do you want?" No reply. I slowly backed away from her, expecting her to move, but she just watched me, that same intense look on her face. I took another step back, then another, steadily backing away from her until I felt confident enough to turn and carefully walk away. As I reached a better lit area, I began to move more quickly, all the while keeping my eyes trained on her shadowy form. She stood there for some time, statuesque in fact. Then, abruptly having spontaneously abandoned whatever plan that she may have had for me, she turned from me and, without looking for traffic, she crossed the street with long strides and disappeared around the corner of a building. Something about the casual air of it, though, just really disturbed me. I kept my eyes trained behind me on my walk home, afraid that she would follow me. The bridge was well lit, and I saw no sign of her, knowing that this was the only way for her to follow me and keep up on foot. I breathed a sigh of relief. I saw no more cars headed from the city, no more pedestrians out walking. Thankfully, nothing happened after that. I'm not sure why, but I didn't call the cops that night. I still regret having not called, despite my roommates insisting that I do so. I just remember sort of thinking that I wasn't sure what to say to the cops, that I hadn't really been attacked, I guess, that they wouldn't be able to find her anyway. I made up excuses, I guess, but I suppose I must have been in shock maybe, in denial at having been nearly ambushed, especially by someone smaller than me, in my own city, so close to my apartment. One of my roommates called the cops for me, though, and a cop did drive through the area, but by that point, she was gone. So So I live in the southwest of the UK, and years ago, when I was around 17, this would have been about 15 years ago I think, I got kicked out by my mum, who I was living with, because we had an argument. I wandered the streets that night, trying to stay awake. I asked friends if I could stay with them, but that wasn't an option, unfortunately. At the time, I lived in a relatively new suburban area, so I decided to walk into the nearby woods that overlooked some farmland, hoping to watch the stars and find a place to sleep. This was at around 2 in the morning. There was a large wooded area near some flats, and I crawled through a thicket which led to an open space. As I walked through, it was pitch black, and I thought that this would be a nice, safe area to try and sleep at. As I lay down, suddenly I heard footsteps though. They sounded heavy and loud, and it sounded like they were circling me. I froze and asked if somebody was there. The footsteps got faster and faster, pacing around me. Then I heard a deep growl, and whatever it was, it sounded big. I panicked and ran away through that same thicket and back onto the street. At the time, I had about £100 in my bank account, so I wandered to a nearby hotel to see if I could get a room, but they wouldn't let me in. I was cold, desperate and scared, so I walked to a nearby 24-hour shop, bought some snacks, a torch, and I made my way back to the thicket, and this time I was armed with light. When I returned to the woods, I heard the footsteps again. I quickly turned on the torch, shining it all around, looking for where the footsteps were coming from, but I couldn't see anything. Then I heard the growl again, and it was deep and reverberating. It sounded like it was right next to me. I could hear it, but I couldn't see it, but whatever it was, it sounded big. And no matter how much I shone that torch around, I just could not see what was making the noise. I ran away to a nearby bus stop, and I spent the night there awake but scared, and spent my night there too. The next day, I met up with a friend and I told her what had happened, and I wanted to investigate, so me and her went to go through that thicket and into that open place. And she was scared after the story that I told her, but it was daylight. I went in again and she stayed outside. But I heard the growl again, really loud and really close. But it was daylight this time, and I could hear it but not see it anywhere. I know that this sounds crazy, but believe me, it scared the absolute living daylights out of me. And nobody believes what I witnessed. And really, I don't blame them, because I wouldn't believe it if somebody told me too. But if you have any similar stories, then please do let me know, because I would love to hear them and know that I'm not the only one who has experienced something like this. This happened a few hours ago. So in my town, there's a story that a guy has moved into the deep woods close to our town. I never believed it, as I go for night drives occasionally, and I've never seen him or anything resembling a man that lives in the woods. Anyway, tonight I decided to go for a drive and drove past a pizza place. Being hungry, I decided to get a pizza before I went home. In my head, I had a plan to eat the pizza and play some Minecraft, as I'm in my 2-week Minecraft phase at the moment. I paid for my pizza and started walking to my car with the pizza in one hand and my phone in the other hand, messaging my friend if he wanted to play some Minecraft when I got home. I look up from my phone to cross the road to the car park, and I see something under my car. It looks like a shadow or something dark. I put my phone in my pocket and pull out my keys. I unlock the car to scare off anything close to the car. I was thinking that it could be a cat or a dog just sort of hanging around my car, but when I unlock the car, nothing happens. No cat running away and nobody running away. The shadow looked like it was cast from the driver's side, so I was going to have to look at whatever it was, whether I wanted to or not to get in. I put my keys away and pull out my phone again and turn the flashlight on to see better in the dark. And as I turn towards the driver's side of my car, I see him. A dirty, naked man with big eyes staring right at me. He was crouched down trying to hide from me, and Now, I don't usually get scared of anything really, but this guy terrified me. He looked like he had rolled around in mud and it had dried out his skin. His eyes looked creepy, bloodshot and kind of bulging out of his head, and obviously he was completely naked. I get startled and sort of jumped backwards out of instinct, dropping my pizza in the process. It falls out of its box and onto the floor. I start moving back slowly and shout at him to get away from my car. He looks up at me and then at the pizza, then back at me again. He tilts his head to one side and then jumps towards the pizza like a dog, grabs it, and starts running away down the road, and I assume that he ran all the way to the woods. I wouldn't know where he went as I didn't feel like following him, but he definitely was in those woods somewhere. I lock my car and run back to the pizza place, and I just stay there for a bit. The workers obviously don't believe me when I tell them what had happened, but I know what I saw. Once the fear subsides after a while, I realize that this guy just stole my pizza. Angry as I was looking forward to it, I decided to get another one and run to my car this time. I get in and put the pizza in the passenger seat, and then I just go home. Once I got home, I locked all of my doors and windows. I even locked my bedroom door as I feel a little bit scared still. I think that I'll be playing Minecraft until the sun comes up. This entire scenario happened a few years ago when I used to take walks alone, occasionally at night, which is something that I thought very little of since I lived in a heavily residential wealthy area. In other words, on the trail I'd frequent, houses were always within sight. On one such night, shortly into my walk, I see a figure walking a few 100 feet behind me, something that I knew immediately was pretty odd, considering it was around 10 at night at the time. At first, I discounted this thought, since it was a public trail, and they could have very well been doing the exact same thing as me, just going for a walk. I continued on for roughly 5 to 10 minutes or so before looking behind me once more, only to find the same person still trailing me. Keep in mind that at this point, I'd gone through a few turns by now on the trail, meaning that it was becoming more and more unlikely that this person just so happened to be going to the same location. I decided to take odd paths and directions, turning off into the gravel and weirder, more roundabout side areas, and they still followed me. By the time that I was reaching the apex of my journey, passing by the local park, they were maybe less than 60 feet behind me, a distance that they could easily have covered in seconds. It's then that I decided to call my family. I had researched for this, I knew what to do, and believe it or not, the call, it didn't go through. As it turns out, my phone was a recent gift, and its service had been set up improperly, meaning that no matter how many times I frantically called in that moment, nothing would happen. In a decision I call back to as one of my best to this day, I acted as if the call had gone through, and was on the phone with my mum, miming out and talking audibly about my location and the person behind me, beginning to briefly describe them. Even in the act, I wasn't able to really do so, but as I could never get a proper view of their face, as if it was somehow shrouded in something, I did my best with what I had. And sure enough, when I turned around again, they were nowhere to be seen. And not that they had turned off and walked in another direction, but it was as if they weren't there to begin with. Weeks later, my mum told me that a police officer had come into her work and warned about abductions that had been happening in our area, specifically for child trafficking and organ trade. Well, I count myself as very lucky, and whenever I leave the house now, I am very aware, only doing so during the day, while taking a large knife with me too. There was a point later on in that neighborhood that a car clearly followed me, turning around in a cul-de-sac where there was no logical reason for them to be except for me. But this was the most obvious example of, well, an attempted kidnapping. This is a bit of a long one, but I think about it once in a blue moon, and I wanted to share it somewhere so that it would be permanent. I thought others might be interested too, so I thought that I would tell it here. I always sensed a bit of, well, something, but this was my first real paranormal experience, I guess you could say. I was 16 to 17 at the time, and we moved into an old rundown house. I hated one section of the house in particular, including 2 bedrooms and a hallway, from the second that I stepped foot in there. One of those bedrooms ended up being my room too. I absolutely hated that house. I constantly felt this presence that was so heavy, loud, dark, but not in the way that we typically feel, hear, or see things. That was the best way that I could describe it. It was almost like a physical thing that would follow me around, like I was aware of where it was at any given time. I could feel it coming, and it would always fill me with dread. I was terrified. I would try to go to sleep at night, and I could feel it moving towards me. It felt like it was crushing me, and it was so dense, and I couldn't move. Sleep paralysis every night. I would often just be sitting on the lounge, and I could feel it coming towards me. I felt like I was being preyed on. It would happen so constantly that I would stay at my nan and pa's house a lot, but it literally never happened to me unless I was in that house. Now, in a different house, my twins were around 3 years old at the time. They would talk about the man who supposedly sat in the sunroom and lived in the wall. They would point at one section of the wall in the hallway. They said that he was nice and protected them from the girl, and the girl freaked them out. Like, they would sprint back into the lounge room and say that they couldn't go anywhere because the girl was there. They described a little girl around 5 years old who had white skin, black hair, black eyes, cuts on her skin, wore undies, and would hiss at them with an angry face if they looked at her. The girl supposedly lived in my sister's cupboard, and they were too young to work it out at the time, but the back of my sister's cupboard was the same as the wall in the hallway where the man lived. They said that heaps of people lived in there, and we tried, but we could never find out much information about the house. Fast forward a few more years, another different old house. Hadn't experienced anything in that house until, well, stuff started happening out of nowhere. One of my twins, maybe 7 years old at the time I think, suddenly became terrified of going to bed. She refused to sleep with this one toy in her room, an old doll's pram that we had recently been given secondhand. She said that there was a black man with a tall hat who had pushed the pram back and forth in her room. The squeaking of the wheels was so loud that she had to block her ears, and he wanted her to look, but she would hide under her blanket, allegedly. And look, I know that this is going to sound bad, but I didn't really take it too seriously at the time, and just sort of kept brushing it off. At the same time, I had started having horrific nightmares, all of them about trying to protect my kids from being taken in weird places with lots of people around. They were so vivid and awful, I was constantly stressed and dreaded going to sleep. One night in the middle of the night, I'd woken up from one of those nightmares and I walked to the bathroom. I looked down the hallway and I swore that there was something at the end of it. Maybe a little bit insane, but I said, if there's something there, then please leave. And then the light switched on. I was beyond shocked. That was still to this day the most undeniable, cannot gaslight myself out of seeing that, experience that I've ever had. I didn't put 2 and 2 together as well, until the other twins started talking about it too. I had asked her to brush her teeth one night, and she had walked into the bathroom, but then sprinted back and jumped on the bed. She said, "Mom, I know you're not going to believe this because it's not real, but it is," and then went on to explain the same top hat man who she said had been hanging around the house for a couple of weeks. She said that he followed her around and watched her while she was in her room or the bathroom. I asked if she had ever spoken to her twin about it, but she said no, so I called her in. The conversation that they had then was really creepy too. but fascinating to listen to. They were going back and forth describing the same experiences and agreeing with each other. I have no idea why they hadn't talked about it to each other until then, but everything kind of clicked into place then, and we were like, okay, this is weird. We need to sort this out. Ceremoniously threw the toy pram out the front door, and we tried out a bunch of hippie house cleansing stuff, and weirdly, it just never happened again after that. Now, you're probably not going to believe this, but we were in yet another old house afterward. Super straightforward experience here, but I kept feeling a light, white, feminine presence around me, like I would see a white, cloudy thing out of the corner of my eye sometimes. It didn't feel threatening, so I'd just carry on about my day. Happened pretty often in that house too. On the other hand, one of my twins refused to sleep in her initially designated bedroom because of what she called the fat lady. One of the first nights we lived there, she came bolting out of her room screaming because the fat lady supposedly stuck her head out of the wall above her and screamed in her face. I didn't hear anything about it after the first week or two of living there, but she would not go back in that room. Just before I gave birth to my fourth child, I could feel this super positive energy around, like undeniably something there, almost like a physical thing that I could see and feel as a light, airy thing. I didn't acknowledge it to anyone, I just felt it there, but one day my daughter walks into my room and we're chatting for a sec. I could feel this presence in the hallway at my door but didn't say anything. As my daughter walked out, she paused for a second in the doorway, turned around to me and went to say something, but I stopped her, told her to wait, and I quickly wrote down what I had just been seeing or feeling, then told her that she could start talking. And yeah, she goes on to ask if I've noticed the white shadowy thing hanging around. I showed her what I had written down, and that one was a pretty cool experience. I don't know why, but I was always certain that it was my partner's nan. I'd never met her, but something was telling me that. And this is our current experience and what has prompted me to dig all of this up and share it with you guys. My pa died in April of this year, and a few days after his funeral, my son's toys started turning on when I'd walk past his room. I brushed it off as it was nothing really significant enough for me to mention to my sister, but just so I had it in writing, I guess I wrote it down. I didn't acknowledge it to anyone else. Since then, though, my son, 5 years old, has been talking about what he calls the magic in his room. He's constantly telling me about how the magic keeps moving his toys and taking out his books. I keep suggesting that maybe it's one of us moving his things, but he is adamant that it's the magic. He says that it wants to push my cars. It's like a person, but it's not because that's not real. Like the fairies and stuff. He has said that it's weird, but he doesn't seem scared by it or anything. And well, if you've gotten this far, then thanks for listening. I don't blame you if you think that I'm insane and full of it or both. I honestly don't put too much thought into all of this in my day-to-day life. Just a little bit of a collection of unexplained experiences that I've had, I guess. I have no idea what to make of it all, but it's definitely opened my eyes to the other side of, well, life, I guess. I hope that there's a God because, well, I have a lot of questions for him when I die. I get night terrors pretty often, well, ever since I was in a crib really. Although, over the decades I've learned to manage it, and I manage it with like anti-anxiety meds and SSRIs. Usually I've chalked these up to being extremely realistic nightmares, or just night terrors. They have been really bad before, usually involving some kind of human or humanoid form staring at me, causing me to scream and bolt out of my bed, sometimes injuring myself too. Side note as well, if anyone has experience with ultra-realistic nightmare hallucinations like these of people, well, then please let me know. I've been trying to dig for more information since I read here that usually with night terrors, people don't remember them, but I remember mine vividly every time. Anyway, last night, and I'm a 29-year-old female, my boyfriend, 31 male, slept over. I was in the twilight state, which is usually when I have these hallucinations, and instantly opened my eyes to see a bluish, slightly glowing humanish form shooting face first right at me. It was super quick. Visually, it looked like it was coming at my face like a sharp burst of air, I guess. I screamed and swatted the air and then frantically told my boyfriend to turn on the light, which he did. But what really surprised and unsettled me was that after a couple of minutes of pacing and looking terrified, my boyfriend told me that a millisecond before I screamed, he had been startled to see a black shape shoot across the room towards me. When I shrieked and panicked, his first thought was apparently, oh heck no, she saw it too. Understandably, he has requested that we stay somewhere else tonight. He described seeing a glimpse of a statuesque face like the Statue of Liberty's, which is close to what I saw too, I guess. Except the bluish glowing figure had a sort of contorted or mocking or maybe amused look on its face. The vibe that I felt was that it wanted to scare me, like a prank. I guess I wanted to see too if anyone else here has experienced something similar or has advice on how to handle this. It is the first time that someone besides myself has seen one of my night terrors, and honestly, I'm just kind of stunned. I'm actually going to a spiritual shop later today, so if anyone has any recommendations on what to buy, I'd be grateful for that help. Honestly, I feel ridiculous about this story, but something came up that makes me want to share it, and so here I am. Over a week ago, I was coming home late from a friend's house and was fairly tired by the time that I pulled into the road to my house. As I got close to my house, my attention was fixed in the front of my house, and I have this small front porch with a light that turns on at 7 o'clock automatically, and there's a small table that I decorate up for the holidays, and a small plastic chair in the corner. And as I was pulling up to the house, it looked like a man was sitting in that chair. I was around 35 yards away from the house at this point, but what I could make out was a thin man with pale hair sitting down facing the road. At first, I thought it was my dad, because he has dementia and it can be difficult to get to the porch safely in some areas due to soft dirt and all that. But as I got closer, it looked like the man was younger and had darker hair. I was already trying to figure out what I was going to do about some stranger on my front porch, but as I turned my vehicle into my drive, the car lights washed over the porch and suddenly the chair was empty. The only thing that I could think to do was sit there for a moment to try and understand what had happened. A part of me wanted to believe pareidolia and exhaustion hit to create what I saw, so I was shaky as I gathered my stuff up and ran inside, effectively smacking my foot against a wooden post that makes up my front porch cover and possibly breaking my toe, but that's another story. And I was telling myself that my brain made it up. The next day I was telling my mother about what happened. I live on my parents' property, so my mother can see my porch pretty easily. And she admitted that she had seen shadowy figures standing on my porch and had thought that a man was sitting on my porch a few weeks before this. And not only that, but she heard a man's voice at my door one evening when I was out. I'm single though, and so she thought that maybe it was one of my brothers or guy friends. She said though that nobody was there, and she heard him talking when she had barely taken a few steps inside of my home. I didn't know what to make of any of that, but last night I saw the man again. I had moved the chair out of the corner, still thinking that I had seen things, and my mind was on spring rolls and some TV when I got home late last night from work, so when I pulled up to my driveway and I saw the man sitting there, I made sure to turn my lights off before pulling in this time. And this time, I know that I saw him. A thin man with a thin face, greyish brown hair, and wearing a burgundy shirt. He was sitting there again, staring at the road. I sat in my car staring at him for almost a minute, and then turned my lights on and, like before, he disappeared. But this time, I could see him disappear. There was nothing behind him that could have caused any of this because my house has an off-white paneling. So now I have no choice but to believe my mother's encounters, which is troubling to say the least. I already know that my house is haunted, but I've never seen a male spirit before now, and it certainly makes me a little bit uneasy. After I went to college, my little brother still lived at my mum's house. Late at night, when she was asleep, he would sneak out into the driveway to smoke a cigarette. He did this a lot, and one night he was out a little later than normal, around 3 a.m. Now, right across from my mum's house lived an older couple who traveled a lot, and on this night they weren't home. They had a big backyard with a lot of mature trees, shrubbery, and outbuildings like a chicken coop and a couple of old sheds. And as my brother was sitting out there, he heard a scream come from their backyard area. It sounded like a man yelling like "ah" as if in pain, very guttural and primal but muffled and distant. My brother was petrified. The screaming continued for a few moments and then stopped. He said that he had this horrible feeling though, like he was terrified of it, instead of worried for whoever it was. So he went back inside and tried to forget about it. Well, a couple of weeks later he was back out again at around 3 in the morning, and at the exact same time as before, he heard the screams again. It sounded the exact same as before, and again he was absolutely terrified. Several weeks later, the woman who lived in that house was taking a walk while my brother was outside. She stopped to say hi, and my brother decided to tell her about the screaming. She chuckled and said yes. When they moved into that house years ago, apparently the children who had lived there before them, they had told them that the backyard shed was allegedly haunted. And that is pretty creepy. This is the closest that I've gotten to having my own ghost story, and, well, I figured that I'd share it. I've been living next to this giant graveyard for around 2 years now. It hosts around 50,000 graves. It's genuinely beautiful and often a place that I've visited just to walk around. So, I had this awful day at work. This was about 12 years ago now, but I remember it vividly. Horrible day. One of those days where I just didn't want to go straight home and deal with all of the home sort of jobs and socializing, cleaning, dinner, etc. Instead, I planned on driving to a mountaintop lookout where there's a cool ice cream venue, grabbing a cone and watching the world drift by while I just sort of decompressed. But at some point, I took a wrong turn and I ended up in the neighborhood surrounding the cemetery. So I figured, to heck with it. It's quiet and a cemetery walk would be the peace that I needed. It was dusk outside, but plenty light enough that I could clearly see trees, houses, names on the gravestones, and if anyone else was around too. I knew in about 45 minutes to an hour that it would be dark outside, but for now I felt comfortable. I parked my car and walked over to the berm into the graveyard. Now, this graveyard is massive, by the way. Without signs and streets, it would be impossible to find your way through this maze, and there was no way in heck that I was planning on walking that far in. I just kept to the sidewalk where the berm and the houses were, while the massive graves were on the left of me. I called my then boyfriend, crying to him about how awful my day had been, and he was trying to calm me down and talk me through my day. In my peripheral to the left of me, I thought that I saw a big black shadow at some stage, maybe 50 meters in. It was only brief that I saw it, or I think that I saw it. I wasn't sure if I saw what I even saw, and Had I left just then, I probably would have shrugged it off, but my fight or flight instincts definitely had kicked in. I was still on my phone, but became extremely wary of what it was that I think that I saw, if I saw anything at all. So I'm walking and looking in that direction while I'm still on the phone, my eyes peeled just in case something happened, but I definitely began to start feeling uneasy, and I'm now absolutely focused on anything that might be there with me. I'm a woman walking alone in a graveyard after all. I'm more concerned with a creepy guy skulking around than I am anything paranormal, but I still feel very uncomfortable and on edge. Anyway, as I'm walking and talking but still looking in that direction that I first spotted the shadow, it appeared again. But this time, I'm staring right at it, literally watching it manifest, as if it collected this energy or particles and formed a giant black mass, just opaque enough for me to see the gravestones it moved through, but much, much darker than the surrounding area. It was quite tall, much taller than the average human with no arms or legs. Just a moving black mass is the best way that I can describe it. It drifted through several gravestones for about 4 seconds, which is long enough for me to question whether or not I'm seeing things, and then confirming, no, I am definitely looking straight at this thing and that it is not a person. It was maybe a little bit closer than when I saw it the first time, but not by much. Maybe 40 meters now. 4 seconds is really a long time to see something and watch it move like this. But I just stared at it, and I think that I stopped talking on the phone completely at some stage. I don't remember what I thought at the time other than the confirmation to myself that what I'm seeing is real. Then, as quick as it appeared, it just vanished, like a fog dissipating again. Instantly, I got this image in my head that the next time that I saw it, it would be right in my face. So I quickly told my boyfriend that I would see him at home, turned and hurriedly walked to the car and left. And quite honestly, I just feel like maybe something was looking out for me and sending me a warning that whatever that thing was, it did not have good intentions and I needed to leave. I don't remember being very scared while I was driving. I don't feel like anything followed me or was in the car with me or anything. But it definitely snapped me out of whatever mood that I was in that day. When I got home, I told my boyfriend what happened immediately and, well, he just shrugged it off, saying that it must have been me hallucinating since I was super emotional. I was really irritated at that response. I mean, I know what I saw, and I am usually a really calm, rational person, so there's no way that I just got so carried away with my emotions that I started seeing things. That felt so unreasonable of a response to me and so invalidating. I lived with my uncle at the time and told him what had happened and how I was really disappointed with my boyfriend's response. That's when he suggested that maybe I saw something because I was emotional and vulnerable. Maybe my walls were down and it was drawn to me. And the more that I think about that incident, the more that just feels right. I think that whatever it was, it seemed curious about me. Maybe I did have some walls down. I don't know, but I don't think that whatever it was had good intentions. I'm just glad to not have any lingering experiences with whatever that was. It's been so many years and I remember it so vividly, and I'm always racking my brain wondering what the heck that thing was. I've even considered talking with psychics about it just to hear what their opinions are, but anyway, I'm just curious about your guys' thoughts and I wanted to share my experience. A few years back, I lived in Berkshire County, Massachusetts, named for the Berkshire Mountain Range. The Berkshires are actually a sub-range of the northern Appalachian Mountains, and I assume if you spend any time in paranormal spaces like here, then you know that weird stuff happens in the Appalachians. I guessed that I'd figured since I was so far north that I was safe from the usual abbey haunts, safe to whistle at night or walk the woods alone and all that, or to not close my curtains after dark at the very least. I really think now that I was wrong. Now, it was either late summer or early fall of 2020, and my fiancé and I were leaving the tiny suburb where we lived to go to a nearby bigger city for cheaper groceries. In order to get there, we had a 20 to 30 minute drive, the first leg of which was through a heavily wooded hilly area. It must have been around, 6 or 7 during the evening, still bright out and well lit, though visibility was poor because everything is lush green bushes and trees there. But we were driving up a hill road with a couple of houses, both sides of the street, full to bursting with plant life. The green was super dense and impossible to see into. It was warm, so we were driving with the windows down, and as we got to the top of the hill, we heard what I can only describe as a strange noise. My partner and I both grew up surrounded by woods and wildlife, so we know deer when we hear them. Some people who are unfamiliar with deer might think that they're serene and totally silent, but when deer want to be loud, they can make some really haunting sounds, especially if it's a male calling long distance. It's a long, booming sort of honk, like a war horn almost. Think in the family of a bagpipe, but with the edge that clearly marks it as an animal instead of mechanical. Anyway, we recognized it as a deer, but it sounded wounded. The honk was sort of distressed and wobbled at the end, like the deer was losing strength. Unfortunately, people speed in the area, and it wasn't unbelievable that some idiot had hit a deer and drove off without calling animal control or helping in any way. We couldn't see any skid marks, blood, or a body on the road. So I asked my fiancé to pull over into someone's driveway so that I could check the dense foliage on the sides of the road. Deer like to hide themselves and hide their babies, and I, a bleeding heart animal lover, and also an idiot I know, was on the verge of panicking about how we were going to help this injured baby deer. I mean, I was already making plans to visit the veterinarian hospital in the area, one that kept late night hours as I began pushing aside bushes and looking around. I've never interacted up close with a deer, so I was making sort of soft little come here kitty sounds, cats being my only reference at the time. Silly, I know, but I searched the bushes on the side of the street with the houses, which was slightly less dense because of the driveways, but in the end I found nothing. I checked both ways and crossed to the heavier wooded side and began looking there as well. Now, I don't have the best eyesight to begin with, so sorting through the green was difficult, and it took me some time as well. My fiancé was busy speaking with the homeowner of the driveway that we parked in. He had come out to see if we had had an accident or a flat tire and if we were okay. Luckily, I heard a rustle. My heart dropped though as I realized that it was right against the edge of the road, in the very first row of bushes. Definitely not an ideal hiding spot for a deer, which meant that the poor creature might have been in worse condition than I thought it could have been, dragging itself deeper into the foliage if it wasn't. I moved downhill towards the sound, placing myself right at the crux of the road's turn, a blind corner. The rest, well, it just happened so fast, but for me it was like slow motion. So, I bent down to move some branches aside where I thought the rustling had come from, hoping that the animal wouldn't run or try to jump at my face. I was so entranced with finding it, with helping, I wouldn't be able to live with myself if I had left a hurt animal behind. I finally cleared the bottom of the bush, seeing the ground with its leaf litter. Baby deer camouflaged nicely into the fallen leaves and the dirt, so I stared into the space hard, but there was nothing there. No shapes, no eyes, no movement, just dirt. Still, I felt compelled to stay there in that position, back to the road. It felt like if I just looked long enough that the deer might appear in front of me. But what actually appeared directly behind me was a speeding minivan taking the turn way too quickly. There are no sidewalks on this street, and no guardrails either. There was just the blind turn, a bad driver who couldn't calculate right, and me at the edge of the road, not looking. I heard the van, and that alone forced me to rip my eyes away from the bushes. I threw myself out of the way of the van and into the leaves, tripping backwards until my back hit a tree that steadied me. I had been only a moment and a few inches away from being absolutely slammed. The van, it didn't even stop too, didn't even seem to acknowledge that they'd almost flattened a person. My fiancé called for me. The search for the deer, which we hadn't heard call again since we first pulled over, was too dangerous to continue. I looked both ways about 1,000 times, panicking, and jittered my way over to the safer side of the street and the driveway that we were in. We got back into our car, listened a moment more, and then we left on our grocery run. My fiancé could tell that something had happened, and I believe that they had suspicions that something other than just the cars spooked me. I didn't want to talk about it though. We were still driving through the woods after all, and we'd have to drive back this way as well. I kept it to myself, the pull that I had felt, the hypnotic way that I had spent hours looking into that hollow in the bushes, the way that I had felt so sure that I would find that injured baby that I was looking for if I'd just stayed right there in that spot. The way that I was sure now, as we pulled away, that there wasn't and had never been an injured deer there at all. But something called me to that spot, and I ignored all the Appalachian advice that I had ever heard. I answered, and I almost ended up a smear on the pavement for it. I don't know why whatever was there wanted to cause someone's death. I don't know why I was able to avoid it succeeding. I don't know a lot of things about the motivations of the old things that live in the Berkshires, what they are, why they do, and what they do, if they hate us or if they're just hungry. What I do know is they exist, and that they're dangerous. Every bit as dangerous as their southern cousins. The northern Appalachians may not be as popular of a topic, but they are no less old, wild, or vicious than the southern counterpart. I can testify to that now. I guess I'm just sharing this because I want people to know that, to remember that even. These mountains are older than bone, older than the rings on Saturn, and things just as old exist there. If we lose sight of that, if we think some miles of distance and a different state boundary protect us, we are walking into a trap with our eyes wide open. Be careful out there. Be careful in the Appalachians, wherever you may find yourself on them. And if you hear something call to you, well, no, you didn't. This happened around 2010 when I was a kid living in northern Florida. I'm 24 now, so it's definitely been a minute, but after hearing a bunch of your creepy stories, I figured that I'd finally share one of mine. So, I grew up in a super haunted apartment, and this is one of the freakiest things that happened to me there. I lived with my dad and sister in a small apartment. By the time that this happened, we'd been there almost 3 years. Paranormal stuff had already been going on, like footsteps, knocking, or hearing people talking when nobody was home. Nothing too wild, but just the kind of stuff that you could brush off and blame on upstairs neighbors. One thing, though, is that I hated sleeping alone, and I was terrified of the dark there, so I would usually stay up playing my DS under the covers. That night, I was doing exactly that until my dad came in, took my DS, and moved the nightlight from the hallway into my room to try to get me to sleep. It was one of those sort of projector nightlight things that lights up the ceiling with stars and planets and all that. So I was just sort of sitting in bed, staring up at the solar system, still wide awake and wired. Then the whole room suddenly just went pitch black for a split second, almost like somebody put their hand over the light. Right after that, too, I saw what looked like the shadow of a man's hand slowly pull away from the projector. Like I could actually see fingers moving and curling back in a fist before pulling its wrist back. Then the ceiling lit up again like nothing happened. I just sat there frozen. Like, did that really just happen? And then, a minute or two after, I saw a black shadow mass dart across the ceiling, blocking the light again for a split second before the room was illuminated again. Well, that was enough for me. I threw the blanket over my head, pressed myself against the headboard, and tried not to move. A few minutes passed, and then I heard and felt 2 loud bangs on the right wall next to my head, like someone full-on punched it, hard. The whole wall and the headboard shook, in fact. I didn't even think. I just ran down the hall to my sister's room, dove under her blanket, and stayed there until morning. The next day I went back to my room and I saw that a fairly large painting that I had hanging right above my headboard was halfway off the wall now, which means that whatever hit that wall, it hit hard enough to nearly tear the nails holding it up on the wall completely out. Well, I literally slept with my sister for 2 weeks after that, and have slept with a lamp on until my adulthood after this. That was just one of many paranormal things that happened to me growing up in Florida. But I think this one stuck with me the most because the activity in that apartment got worse up until in my teens after this had happened. So yeah, don't move to Florida, I guess, is the moral of the story. I think the swamp holds stuff in it, and every time that our landlord paints over dust in an apartment, that it just becomes cursed or something. There's something wrong about that place, and it's hard to put my finger on it. Back in 1985, I was in the middle of a very nasty divorce from my first wife. Things had gone horribly sideways, and even spilled over into my job. Sparing all of the nasty details here, suffice it to say that I had a breakdown of epic proportions. For weeks I couldn't function. I couldn't eat, couldn't sleep, and when I did sleep I was plagued with nightmares. And so, early one day I grabbed a few things and I just began to drive. I had little money and was in a very dark place mentally. Although I had been raised Christian and grew up in a church, I was very far away from God and was living a very non-Christian life. As I drove, I was in a cloud. I could only see darkness, pain, and despair in my future. I could imagine no happiness, no joy, and no future. Again, suffice it to say, I considered my life over at that age of 22. I drove north from Texas and eventually I found myself in Oklahoma City. There I turned eastward towards my childhood home of Tennessee. As I drove, my despair clouded my perception and I became more and more depressed. I really felt like I was driving myself straight into the gates of the abyss. Somewhere in eastern Oklahoma, I pulled in for fuel though in a restroom break. As I resumed my journey, I noticed a man standing at the side of the interstate on a ramp looking for a ride. He was dressed rather peculiarly for the weather at the time, wearing a long old West-style rain slicker and ivy cap, sometimes known as a flat cap or a duckbill cap as well. One reason that I noticed him was because, in my mind, his appearance bore a striking resemblance to the gyro captain from The Road Warrior with Mel Gibson that had come out a few years earlier. I didn't stop, but I continued on my journey and thought nothing more of it. Soon I was forced to stop again as I suddenly needed to use the restroom very badly, which was unusual for me as I could and still do often drive for hundreds of miles without stopping. In any case, I completed my bathroom break and turned back towards the Interstate 40. As I turned onto the ramp, my eyes were drawn to another hitchhiker looking for a ride, only it was not another hitchhiker. It was the very same person that I had seen a short time earlier at my previous stop. I'm quite sure that I did a double take on seeing him because I was so shocked by it. For reasons that I didn't understand at the time but have become clearer later in my life, I pulled over and I offered him a ride. He got in the car and thanked me for the lift. In short time, he began to make what I first assumed was small talk. It was far from small talk, though. It was as though he could read my mind. He talked about life's heartaches and troubles, and it soon became clear that he appeared to know more about me and my troubles than he should. He turned the subject to God and his many blessings, and now, nearly 40 years later, I don't remember exactly what he said, but he seemed to have just the right words that I needed to hear at the time. It was, for lack of a better word, miraculous, the way that he seemed to be able to speak to my soul and lift the burdens that I felt that were crushing my very spirit. He rode with me for the rest of the afternoon, and by the time that we were approaching Little Rock, Arkansas, I felt like a new person. He promised me that everything would work out. He said that I was just beginning on a new journey, and he assured me that there were good things in store for me in the future. It was late in the day as we entered Little Rock, and I decided to get a motel for the night. I stopped at a convenience store to let him out of the car so that he could continue on his way. Before exiting the car, he asked if I could spare a little money for food. I told him that I never give money to strangers because I couldn't know if it was just going to be wasted on alcohol or drugs, but that I would, however, be happy to buy him some food. He graciously accepted my offer, and I turned into the parking lot and went into the store. All these years later, I can still remember exactly what I bought for him that evening. I purchased a pack of Bologna, a half a gallon of milk, and a loaf of bread. I also believe I picked up some condiments as well as a candy bar for dessert. After paying for the items, I exited the store and found him waiting at my car. I handed him the bag of food and thanked him for making me feel better. He in turn thanked me for the ride and the food. I got in the car and started it. Placing the car in reverse, I looked around to be sure that I wouldn't hit him backing out, but I couldn't see him anywhere. Now, because it had only been a moment since he walked toward the rear of my car, I was concerned that possibly he may have tripped and fallen behind me or something. I mean, I didn't want to back over him, so I placed the car in park and I got out to make sure that he was clear. But he was nowhere to be seen. I walked around the car and then I walked around the only other car in the parking lot and nothing. I went into the store and asked the cashier if he had seen where the gentleman in the long coat had gone, and he said that he had not seen anyone in the last few minutes but me. I was confused as the cashier should have had a clear view of the parking lot from the checkout counter. I walked back outside and walked out onto the street corner and looked all four ways, and there was no one to be seen. I walked around and looked behind the building and nothing. I even got down on my knees and looked under my car as well as the other car in the parking lot, but nothing. The man had disappeared as though he was a ghost. There is no way, even if he had run, could he have gotten out of sight as fast as he did. I mean, the man, the bag of food, and the jug of milk that I had given him were gone, vanished without a trace as though they never even existed. Finally, I gave up and I went a short ways down the road and rented a motel for the night. I went in, took a shower, said a short prayer, and then for the first time in weeks, I slept like a baby all night, peaceful and dreamless. Now, the next morning, I awoke feeling refreshed and reinvigorated. The mental clouds were now gone, the burden was lifted, and I felt like a completely new man. I continued my journey eastward with a new zest for life. Eventually, I traveled to Michigan and then to Florida, where I met a woman slightly older than myself. After the divorce from my first wife was final, we were married and we were together for 34 years until she finally passed. Which means that man was right. Everything did work out. My wife and I had a really good life, in fact. There were difficulties, and at times the road was sometimes rocky, but the good far outweighed the bad. And now I am convinced that that man that rode with me all those years ago, that he was an angel or something like that. Often I have looked back on that dark day and wondered where I would be today if it were not for that man's intervention. Seeing what I was going through and, well, where I was heading, I fully believe that I would have been in prison or even dead had he not been standing on the side of the road that day. It really humbles me and makes me wonder what God saw in me that he would send me an angel like that. Since that day, I have often thought about Hebrews 13:2. Do not forget to show hospitality to strangers, for by doing so, some people have shown hospitality to angels without even knowing it. I know many will not believe me. I get it. My story, or my conclusion even. And that really is your prerogative and totally fine. However, I will always thank God for the angel that was sent my way that day, back in 1985. Because without him, I shudder to think where I might be. The other night, around midnight, my mother-in-law, who lives on the opposite end of an adjoined 1-acre plot of land as my wife and I, called my wife telling her that she was hearing a loud wailing sound out back of their house past the tree line. We live in the mountains at the base of a forest. My wife got my attention and told me to come to the window, where we listened for about 10 minutes. And there was a very loud feminine wailing coming from the woods. It was something like the sound of a fox or a coyote makes, but each wail was much longer, louder, and way more human. I have since looked up every wild animal in my area, and have yet to match the sound that I heard to one of them. Right around the time that I thought to record the sound, though, it stopped. I've listened to the recording a few times to see if maybe I could get a glimpse of the sounds that it was making, but I don't think that I caught it. In the recording, though, my mother-in-law talks about how when she first heard the sound, she turned the back porch on and walked outside. She has 2 German shepherds, and they will bark at just about anything, and they spend the majority of their time outside, laying in the yard anyway. But weirdly, neither of them made a sound, or did either of them want to go outside with her that day. She said that she went outside and clapped her hands to try and scare whatever it was away. After a little bit, she saw what she said was a small grey cat, looking to be about domestic size. It walked up to the far side of the creek that separates the backyard from the woods, but it didn't move any closer and then proceeded to go back up the hill into the woods. She said that it felt like it was trying to lead her somewhere. She, being an animal lover like my wife, said that she was worried that there was an animal trapped or hurt, and like some video from the dodo, she was going to go into the woods and find some helpless animal to nurse back to health. Being of sound mind, though, she called us to tell us this and say that she was afraid to go out there by herself, and asked if I would be willing to bring a gun to protect us, in case there was a coyote or something else once we got up there. At the sound of gun and woods and afraid, I was all ears, so I grabbed my plate carrier, a couple of knives, my my pistol, shotgun, my Milwaukee chest-mounted bar light, and a small hand torch. My mother-in-law met my wife and I in our backyard, and I told them to drive up the side of the road and see if they could position the car to shine a light into the woods. I said that I would walk across to the back of their property and go into the woods from there so as to not wake up my father-in-law or alert the dogs or anything. I made my way over and approached the woods from the right side of the property. Just so you understand, the left side of the property is flanked by a long fence that stretches about 2 acres in length. It goes back deep into the woods, separating our property from our neighbors. And on the right side of the property, it's flanked by a small road that leads to a few more houses set far back behind ours. I walked over a small bridge that covers the stream separating the backyard from the woods and walked diagonally toward the fence line. Now, as soon as I stepped foot into the woods, I spotted something reflective just in front of the fence. I had yet to pull out any lights, so I turned on my hand torch and aimed it at the reflection. I walked a bit closer and the light didn't move, so I imagined that it was just a bit of the fence catching the light or something. Once I was about maybe 20 paces away from it, I saw that there was a small grey blob, roughly ovular shape and covered in fur. My first and only thought was raccoon because in that split second it added up, but I then panned my flashlight to the right about 10 feet away, and it landed squarely on a set of eyes. What I had seen before just had been this raccoon, but what I saw after, that was something else completely. This thing was a little bigger than a coyote. It had grey fur, and honestly I cannot recall if it had a tail or ears or anything else, but it was both canine and feline in characteristics, leaning more toward canine in appearance. It stared into the light at me for a few moments, and then started walking slowly deeper into the woods. Now, as far as I know, coyotes and foxes alike would be out of there as soon as they even smelt me or hear me take one step into the woods. Stranger still, this thing was not 10 feet away from this raccoon, and they seemed to be perfectly content. I swapped the light back to the raccoon as it moved behind a large pile of rocks towards the fence. I thought that it must have been a burrow or something, so I panned back toward the creature, and it had now moved really far away, deeper into the woods. I cannot recall actually seeing it move or anything though, and it was just there and then it was miles away. I cannot recall seeing its rear end as well. I just sort of looked up into the woods towards a crest at the top of the hill and saw its eyes again staring at me. I'm not one to just waltz through the woods in the middle of the night. In fact, if I was asked to go into the woods at night, armed the way that I was, I probably would have been freaked out, even if there wasn't anything out there. But strangely, I was completely calm. As soon as I met its gaze, I turned on my chest-mounted floodlight and started making my way towards it. I walked probably about 100 feet deeper into the woods. It still hadn't moved. I kept walking until I saw my neighbor's house. The stretch of woods between their house and the fence narrowed out between the two where a hill sat. The creature, it had been at the top of the hill just barely over the crest when I hear a crunching far off behind me at the base of the woods. It was my wife and mother-in-law. I looked back and saw their flashlights, and when I turned back to look for the eyes again, they had disappeared beyond the crest of the hill. I kept walking until I had a realization that I must have been past our property line at this stage. I pulled out my phone and called my wife and asked her where it ended. She told me that there's a line of small red flags where they had installed out electric fence last summer or something. I looked all around and I couldn't see any. Keeping my eyes toward the hill, I started walking backwards toward our property. I had walked back about 100 feet before I saw the line of small flags. Once there, I turned and made my way back down the hill, and I met them at the base of the woods and showed them where I had seen the two animals. We made our way back down the yard and just barely made it back to the porch when another wail was let out. This time, it was different. It was similar, but it was a deeper pitch, and it came from the direction of the creature that I had followed. From the moment that I pressed record to the moment that I left those woods, not a single sound was made. I was completely silent. The whole time I felt no fear, just an urge to follow it. It was just pure curiosity, I guess, but now when I think back on it, the whole situation makes me really nauseous. Listening to the recording from the other night makes me nauseous too, and I'm really not sure what to think of it. And so, maybe someone here can shed some light. My experience began 2 years ago, during a visit to my hometown in Bangladesh. It was certainly not the first time that I had encountered something strange there. Back in 2008, I had heard footsteps echoing outside the house at night, yet when I had looked, there had been no one there. But that was nothing compared to what I would face this time. The nights in Bangladesh are heavy with heat, thick and suffocating. To survive the stifling air, we leave the doors and the windows open, praying for even the faintest breeze. Iron barriers protect the openings, so even with everything wide open, no one can just slip inside or anything. I've always been a light sleeper, and that night I shared a bed with my little niece while my mother and aunt slept on the floor nearby. It was deep into the night, a black and airless hour. The phone was dead and there was no clock in the room. But I awoke to the faint clattering sound of a can skittering across the ground outside. I froze, my senses sharpening. I waited, heart pounding until the sound stopped. Relieved, I let my body sink back into sleep. Just as sleep began to claim me again, a sound floated through the darkness, the soft, eerie laughter of a woman. It was faint, almost blending into the stillness. At first, I brushed it off. Perhaps it was just one of the mad women who lived down the street. I mean, it happened sometimes. I tried to ignore it, willing myself back to sleep. But then, suddenly, the laughter stopped. A heartbeat later, a scream shattered through the night, so sharp and close that it sounded as if it had been unleashed right outside of our barrier. I shot upright in bed, my blood running cold. I squinted into the darkness beyond the door and the window, but the world outside was an impenetrable black void. The screaming ceased, and the laughter returned. Only now it was no longer distant. It was just outside, right there, laughing as if it already knew that we were listening. But it made no sense. Our driveway is long, winding from the road to the house. Even sprinting, it would have taken someone minutes to reach the gate. And yet, somehow, she was there already, laughing and waiting. I sat frozen in terror, terrified that my niece might wake and see whatever horror was lurking out there. Moving carefully, I slid out of bed and shook my mother awake. She opened her eyes, and I could see immediately that she had heard it too. Together, we roused my aunt, a woman whose fearlessness was legendary in our family. Without a moment's hesitation, my aunt seized a torch and moved to the barrier. She shone the light into the night, sweeping it across the yard. The laughter stopped at once. There was no one there. No figure darting away, no rustle of retreating footsteps, nothing. Refusing to be intimidated, my aunt flung open the front gate and stepped out into the suffocating darkness. Mum and I watched through the barrier, hardly daring to breathe. Minutes dragged past, then my aunt's voice rang out, sharp and fearless. "Who's there? Come out before I come for you." She called again and again into the emptiness of the night, but there was no response. She searched everywhere. There were only 2 ways in or out, both wide and clear. If anyone had been there, they could not have escaped unnoticed. That much was for certain. Still, though, she found nothing. She locked the gate behind her and returned to us. Just as she reached the door, the laughter exploded again, louder, crueler, and right outside once again. We stared at one another in shock, hearts thundering in our chests. It was impossible. My aunt had just searched every corner of the yard. No one had entered, no one had left, and yet the sound was closer than ever. Panic finally seized us. We rushed to wake my brothers and uncles, hammering on their doors. They stumbled out, grabbing torches and sticks, and surged into the night. They unlocked the gate, ready to confront whatever it was. The moment that the gate opened, the laughter stopped. The night seemed to press in on us, thick and unbreathable. They scoured that yard, the porch, the rooftop, searching every shadow, but there was nothing. No footprints, no movement, no sign that anyone had been there at all. Eventually, they returned, telling us to go back to sleep. They offered hollow reassurances about coyotes or wind tricks, but their faces were pale and drawn. I could see the truth in their eyes. They were as shaken as we were. The next morning, no one spoke of it. In fact, they acted as if nothing had happened, but the silence between them said otherwise. I spoke in hushed voices with my cousins, desperate for answers, and they told me about the Farotni, a spirit feared across Bangladesh, a ghostly woman dressed in white, her hair black and tangled, who wanders through the night, laughing and shrieking. She apparently hunts the living, throwing some sort of filth at them if they're unlucky enough to cross her path. She lives to terrify, to haunt. Whether it was truly her that night, I do not know, but all I know is that something was there, and whatever it was, I am confident that it was not human. And I pray that when I return to Bangladesh that it does not find me again.